Go out there, do your own research. Try to show me one primary source, one fragment, one inscription on a stone somewhere that mentions the Torah before 300 BCE.
What if the story held within the Bible is not quite as historical as we might think, and the Abrahamic religions generally don't have much strong evidence to suggest that they are one of the most ancient religions in the world? This might be very controversial, but there has been a revolution in genetics and archaeology in the last couple of decades that is beginning to undermine the history that has held up the historical Abrahamic religions of this world. Now, this is going to be very controversial, but all I am here to do is to present you some interesting ideas. I'm not even sure if many of these are verified. And I'm going to do this by consulting two people who are big into this. And this will be Gnostic Informant and Adam Green. These are two gentlemen who have spent quite a lot of the last couple of years studying deeply biblical history, archaeology, and the religious systems of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And now I actually slow this interview down a little bit because it's one of the first times I've come across much of this information. So you're going to have to be bearing with me as revelations are happening inside of my mind. But I'll give you some groundwork context that will help you digest what is about to go down. Firstly, myself and Gnostic speak at length about the historical problems with Judaism. If you think of Judaism, which is the root of the two Abrahamic religions of Christianity and Islam, you believe this story about this long ancient past where there was Abraham and he went to the Levant, and then his sons went into Egypt, and then they were enslaved, and then Joseph rose up and took over Egypt, and then they got ejected out of Egypt, and then they went into the wandering in the desert, and then they came back and they took over the promised land. And this, of course, is the foundation for the belief in the biblical story. In some sense, if this is not true, we've got some serious problems with the religion as a whole. But it turns out that the archaeological evidence is actually quite sparse. There are two major things that suggest that maybe there were the presence of something like the Israelites in Egypt. One of them would be the Hyksos invaders, and the other would be this thing called the Stele of Memphis or something like this, which has a name which people think is Israel. But outside of that, it's pretty sparse. The genetics don't even tell us that there was this great interrelation of Egyptian blood into the Israelites. The Israelites seem like they always came from the Levant. And what Gnostic does present very eloquently is the theory that Judaism and the history that we understand that comes out of it was actually, in some sense, more constructed long after the fact, during the period of Alexander the Great. And so the idea here is that the Jews, the Israelites, they were in the Levant, which is, I guess, modern Israel now, for a long time, and they were like a tribal people. But they didn't follow something like monotheistic Judaism. They didn't get taken into Egypt. There was no Moses. There was no Ten Commandments. And in fact, they essentially followed something like a pagan religion right up until the days of Alexander the Great. Now, Gnostic presents a really fascinating piece of evidence for this, which is called the Elephantine city, which is a city in the middle of Egypt where there was a Jewish colony, and they were connected with Israel, where the homeland of the Jews. This is in the middle of Alexander the Great's great Hellenic Empire, or like the leftovers of that. And these guys aren't practicing monotheistic Judaism, which at this point was supposed to be established. These people are essentially practicing something like a pagan religion. They don't talk about Moses. They don't bring up Torah. Now, this becomes a big problem because people start to say to themselves, this was only 200 years before Jesus Christ showed up. And the religion doesn't even seem like it's there. And this little city, this little colony was integrated with the Jewish diaspora, like it was all there. And so you have to start to ask yourself some very confusing and interesting questions. And so Gnostic dives into this and what this might mean. And the idea, perhaps, that later, around about this time, maybe as late as, 170, when this Hellenic Empire began to implode, began to fall apart, it lost its political power. There was this opportunity for the Maccabees to jump up and seize a piece of land, and they grabbed Judea. And once they had Judea, they said to themselves, let's build a religion in order to create a, state. We're going to need a story for this state. And so they got the best writers from all around the Hellenic world. They went to Alexandria in Egypt, And they brought these high quality writers and they said, write us a cool religion. And what these guys did is they took Plato, who basically in his Republic lays out the formula for how to build a religion. And then they got all the information from the old tribal gods and the polytheistic gods. And they kind of mishmashed it all up and shaped it into modern Judaism only 200 years before Jesus showed up, which is a significant transformation of the story. Now, you may not agree with this. You may say this is crazy, but Gnostic will present this information. And then with Adam Green, we speak about the rise of Christ and the origins of Christianity. So Christianity, in its roots, has some very strange phenomenon about it as well. Adam goes on to say that maybe Jesus himself was not real. Now, Adam's thesis here actually has some decent evidence, because he goes with the idea that Christianity was actually put together gradually over the decades that came after Jesus Christ's story. And the whole story of Christianity was in some sense made by essentially a bunch of writers trying to come up with this sort of like hero myth. And they were even amalgamating stories from around them and things like this, which I'm sure you've heard before. But the evidence for this is decent. You would see things like the Gospels of Thomas, which were discovered in the 20th century, which contained in Egypt the phrases of Jesus long before they formalized the Bible in Nicaea in Rome. And there's a lot missing out of that. Instead, it paints this picture of more of a sort of hippie Jesus, if you will. I know some people might get mad at that, but maybe the better word would be a Gnostic Jesus. A Jesus who's speaking about, the kingdom of heaven is within, in some sense, a Jungian and psychological Jesus. Interestingly, also the kind of frame of Jesus that Nietzsche presented. And so the idea here is that this original Jesus is different than the one that we have received. The one that we have received includes these ideas of, for example, a redemption from death. The addition in the Bible of things like Revelation, which is actually mainstream known to come quite a bit after Jesus' life. And it makes you ask, what was going on at this point? Was Paul and characters like this constructing a religion? What were their intentions? Were they out to take down the Roman Empire? Were they thinking to themselves, how can we get a religion that counteracts the power of the Roman world? These are all fascinating questions. So we're going to dive into all this stuff now. I hope this paints a little bit of context, and I hope you enjoy. And again, this is speculating, just opening up some avenues and exploring them. I have to research an awful lot of this myself. I recommend you check out the evidence and see what you think as well. Maybe you agree, maybe you disagree, but nonetheless, let's have a listen.
Well, I was raised Christian, Protestant Christian, but never really believed it. Always kind of just instinctually knew it felt like a weird cult. And then, as I grow up and I start learning about the world, I see all of these politicians that are the number one religion in America, evangelical Christianity, Christian Zionists, as they're called. And they believe a foreign country is the Holy Land and a foreign people are the chosen people. And you're blessed if you bless them, cursed if you curse them. And they all go and, touch the wall and stuff. So, it's an apocalyptic death cult. They believe in the rapture. They want to see the end times wars of Gog and Magog. And so that to usher in the second coming of Jesus. So it's all the top politicians, especially on the right, like between Trump and Ted Cruz and Pence and Pompeo and Nikki Haley and DeSantis, they're all like their closest pastors are all of these most extreme, like end time fanatic Christians. And I also document, clips of all the rabbis all over YouTube and what they believe about the end times as well. And a lot of ways they kind of converge and coincide. And it's just, I see it as a threat to the world, apocalyptic death cult that's got us on the verge of World War III. And religion is at the core of the conflict. The whole Judeo paradigm, the story of the last 1700 years. I don't see anything influencing the world more than these, three Abrahamic religions that all enable each other, all argue over a different version of the same story in a way. So that's why that's what I'm covering. It's kind of like the biggest central news issue too of our time. So I was a little ahead of the curve.
Well, yeah, it's very interesting because I do remember you starting and you were like critiquing Zionism and saying like there's problems in politics, like there's a lot of Zionism in politics, and you see now Thomas Massey and you see various other figures who talk about it very openly now, and it's not taboo at all, and that's important to be very, very clear. And you're kind of just going the level deeper then and saying like, well, look, we have to understand that like our religion itself comes from this same nexus of thought. And why do we hold such inherent trust in it? You know, like why are we just turning around and saying it's guaranteed that this is perfect and there's nothing we need to worry about this? Why can't we inspect this? And there's actually quite significant scholarship backing this. Like, it's not like Friedrich Nietzsche is an insignificant figure. He's the person actually who I came across these ideas first, and I actually brought Gnostic and Adam on because they add just so much more detail to my kind of hunch that I got off Nietzsche. Nietzsche would say stuff like, look, he would actually give out to anti-Semitic Christians in Germany. He would say, look, you guys screaming about the Jews, don't you realize that your religion, it comes from the Jews as well? And this is a big shock to people when they start coming across this stuff. And then Nietzsche would discuss in almost like these terms, where he says that there's like it's not his words, but a worldview or Weltanschauung, a way of seeing the world. And if you think about what happens when you become a Christian, it's like you're installing inside of your head this belief that the entire world sort of oscillates around Jerusalem. And the story that happened in Jerusalem was the beginning of time itself. And Christ and the Messiah is like the fulcrum out of which all of history pours. And this
most influential figure. And when you look into it, it looks like he didn't exist. Or at the very least, there's a kernel of truth of a real person, but all the stories we have about him are fabricated from scripture.
Yeah, well, 100%. So let's dive into that one. So this is what when Adam says, for example, the Judeo-Christian paradigm, like it's that way of thinking that you're looking out at the world and you're thinking history centers on Jerusalem. All the prophecy, like this is such a fascinating one, isn't it? Is that all the prophecies in the Bible are an authority, because they were dreamed up they were dreamed up and they came true in Jesus. Therefore, those people are actually an authority and they communicate with God. Like that's this really self-serving narrative. It just all self-verifies. And then people use that as a grounding for like their very feeling of where they go after they die, the foundation of morality, their culture. It's a very, very profound thing of how deep and powerful that is. And to ask questions about that is quite a shocking thing. So Nietzsche would have been one of the first people to point against this. Adam, do you have any last thoughts? And I'm just going to introduce Neil a little bit then, and then we'll maybe go
to finish
Jesus.
on what you said there, like the idea of Jesus being a myth. It's really based on the prophecy con. That's what I talk about. Like, there's two people in the world: people that believe in the prophecies of the nation of priests that are the chosen people of God that like can predict the future, right? And people that don't. And I don't. And people that do, I feel like, are elevating Israel and their God and the Torah to divine status. And that's the dominant religion in the West the last 1700 years. So that's where we're at. It's really biblical criticism at the end of the day. And, that's blasphemy to a lot of Abrahamists. So that's where we're at, unsurprisingly. But let's hear Gnostic. We've been
thank you, Adam. Thank you.
Overbearing him the whole time here.
For how I came into this, I actually was a Christian for a while, and I credit the church in Christianity for being part of the reason why I was able to restore my own life when I was, running with the wrong crowd. We'll say that. We'll keep it brief. Ended up in prison. I've told this story many times in different podcasts on my own channel. Ended up getting saved in church or in prison, right? Believed in Christianity, became a Christian, and read the Bible cover to cover multiple times. Started studying the history of Christianity. Joined the church for years after I got out. Years. I mean, we're talking. I was in prison in 2011. And I didn't leave Christianity until like 2020, recently, 4 or 5 years ago. I think by that point, though, I was kind of just going through the motions. I think I mentally checked out maybe a year or two before that, and I was just kind of like, it's hard to just leave. You know what I mean? Anyways, long story short, I started studying the history of Christianity, studied my way out of Christianity, realizing that the evidence is so poor. These are the two major things that I call them the two pillars of Judeo-Christianity. One of them is that the Old Testament, the Torah, the Tanakh, the Septuagint, whatever you want to call it, Pentateuch, what we call the Old Testament, is this ancient Bronze Age, or I mean, some people say Bronze Age, started in the Bronze Age by Moses, completed in the Iron Age by the prophets Zerubbabel and whatever his name is, Nehemiah. Sorry, and Nehemiah is the last prophet, and then they sealed the books, and then they waited for Jesus, right? And it's just completely wrong. In fact, I just want to give your audience a challenge for me. Go out there Do your own research. Try to show me one primary source, one fragment, one inscription on a stone somewhere that mentions the Torah before 300 BCE. You can't. There is a fragment from a guy named Hecataeus of Abdera, who lived in the end of the 4th century, so like 320, probably around there, who writes about Moses and Abraham. He writes, so there was legends floating around in the 4th century about Abraham and Moses. Before that, there's nothing. Zero. Now, I'm not saying that Israel didn't exist. The Judah didn't exist. Those kingdoms existed. The kings existed. Hezekiah is a real king. Josiah is probably a real king. They're all probably, the history is there. But what I'm saying is the scriptures, the mythology of the Old Testament, the Torah, stories about Abraham, stories about Noah, stories about Moses, those don't exist until the end of the 4th century BC, early 3rd century BC.
Lovely.
Now that's one of the biggest things to me that holds up Judeo-Christianity, is like this old prophetic text. For example, Daniel is like spot on the money, predicting all this stuff. And then you find out that Daniel was probably written around 164 BCE in the time of the Maccabees, because it's sort of Daniel sort of speaks to Maccabees, and Maccabees sort of answers back. So they're probably written at the same time by the same people. That's the one pillar. We can get into that. We can go deeper into that if you want. The other one is that Jesus is this special, unique, historical philosopher sage in history. And the truth is like, I think there probably was a guy named Jesus of Nazareth.
Oh dear.
But the gospels written about him, completely fabricated. They're either drawing from Old Testament stories. For example, they'll prophecy of Isaac carrying his wood to his own death. Then they got the picture of Jesus carrying his own cross to his own death. Those type of parallelisms are all throughout the text. So you have to, at some point, you have to say, did this actually happen? Because in that case, these are like self-fulfilled prophecies. For Jesus to get on a donkey and ride into Jerusalem, earlier in the passage, you already told us that Jesus was preaching in the temple and he knew the story. So was he self-fulfilling these prophecies? You got to go, what the hell? For example, when Jesus and Barabbas are being put in front of the people, and they're all like, "Oh, we want to kill Jesus. Let Barabbas go." That's an allegory of Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur, they bring out 2 goats. One of them is set free, and the other one is sacrificed for the sins of Israel. So it's like people in Jerusalem would have been like, "Wait a minute, why are we doing a human version of the Yom Kippur right now?" You would think they'd be like, "What are we doing? This is weird." But they're just like NPCs going through with it. It's such an odd thing when you think about it. And so the things that and then outside of the biblical parallelisms from the Old Testament to the New, you also have this new injection of philosophical concepts that we find in Middle Platonism, sayings of Jesus, the mystery. It's very mystery religion, like, where it's like whoever hears these sayings will never taste death. Orpheus says similar things in the Divinity Papyrus. Whoever has ears to hear will have the knowledge in Hades to get reincarnated. He says that. Mm-hmm. So you have this very Orphic, Judaic, new Judaism that's not focused on the temple, but it's now focused on the Gentile world itself. Mm-hmm. So and that's why I don't think you can separate Judaism from Christianity, but they're both Hellenistic. They're both. So, last thing I want to say real quick, the Old Testament is very much, in my opinion, influenced by Plato.
Yes. Okay.
Plato's demiurge, Plato's creations myths, the law codes that we find in Deuteronomy and Numbers and Leviticus.
Oh yeah.
You can line them up with Plato's laws. There's a book called Plato's Laws, no more. Okay. And you can find a lot of the stuff in Plato's Laws finds its way in the Torah. That's a whole deeper topic we can go into.
Well,
those are the two things.
So that's going to be a good conspiracy, man, because I do actually know of that one, and I'd love to see the details you have in it. So we will definitely look at the sort of the sort of arrival of Judaism in the world stage, and what if it's like way more shallow because people say like it goes back into prehistory, of course. And again, like for a lot of people, I'm gonna have to slow this down often and just try simplify it so to make it accessible, because a lot of people don't understand the relevance of going into all these nerdish details, you know, and me with my spectacles on being like, this is so cool. Why? Well, it's all about the way it influences the mind and the way it influences how you understand reality. Because again, a big part of why people accept Christianity, for example, and accept Judaism and accept Islam as an authority in their life to dictate to them on how the world works and should work, comes from its ability to gain authority by saying stuff like, we have an account in the entire history of the world. So this is the thing that was big in the 19th century. The world is only 6,000 years old because the Bible says so, you know. And those type of things, they're very suspicious. This is proper philosopher type stuff here, you know. We're sort of saying to ourselves, epistemologically, why is that a good way to base your knowledge? Is that good enough? And so this is a big thing that Nietzsche has a brilliant essay about this. It's one of his earliest essays. It's called The Use and Abuse of History. And it's this idea of like, if I can go into your mind and I can paint a historical story, and it tells you like, you know, the Irish, imagine I tell Adam, it's like, you know, Adam, you got that green background, you know, the Irish invented the color green, and your name Green, you know, we invented that. And so you basically should send money to us Irish, or else we'll be very, very upset. You're sinning against the Irish super soul. The history, stories, they actually give an enormous amount of power. Like think, for example, of modern Israel. How much wealth do they harvest out of the Christian Zionists in America because of these stories? It's weird and irrational and confusing to people, but it's actually a very real phenomenon that because people believe
can I comment on that real
benefit. Quick? Yeah, go
on. I before I forget, because what you just said there, I'm gonna put my tinfoil hat on for a second right now, and I rarely do this, but this is something that I have actually considered recently. And it might sound a lot out there to a lot of people. If the scholars watch this, they're probably going to completely question my rationality on this, which is fine, fair enough. But if you look at scholarship of Christianity between the 19th and 20th century, so you know the James Frasers, the Jesse Westons, those type of scholarship from the 19th and 20th century. Early, I would say first half of the 20th century. And there's a reason why I want to be specific on there. Right after 1948, the state of Israel, all of a sudden scholarship has this big push towards proving Jesus existed historically, number one. Number one, separating him from paganism, that James Fraser was actually wrong. By the way, people who don't know what I'm talking about, James Fraser wrote The Golden Bow, which is a book about the rituals and ancient myths of dying and rising gods having an impact on the Christian story of Jesus. And this was widely accepted. He changed the whole paradigm of scholarship on Christianity. People at that point were accepting that Christianity was heavily influenced by not just Judaism, but also paganism. That was a widely accepted thing up until right around 1950. All of a sudden, after 1950, after we have a state of Israel, all of a sudden, the scholars at Yale and Harvard and Columbia are all pushing back against Fraser. Fraser's wrong. Jesus is actually very unique and special, and he definitely existed. And the Old Testament is actually very old. We could find layers that go back really far, even though it was completed at 300. We can find layers in the text that go back to 900 BC. Some of them will say. Even today, scholars say that it's nonsense. But those, and I noticed, and I'm thinking to myself, it's funny because it's after 1950, even up to till today, to right now in 2024, where those two things are pushed heavily by the main consensus of academia. And here's where the tinfoil hat comes in, and it makes me wonder: is this a national security risk for people to say that Jesus is not special and unique and didn't exist, or to say that the Torah is really just a Hellenistic text and that there is no claim to this land?
No, it's
think
like,
about that.
It's like
if you have the whole Western world believing those two things, Jesus is real and he really was a great prophet, and the Old Testament is actually very old. Now they're going to be more willing to support the cause in the Middle East.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, like this is Plato 101, the magical myth. and it has a huge persuasive power on people. And so this is basically like, what we're digging into here. We're kind of thinking to ourselves, all right, think of how deep these stories and these influences have. And it's actually incredible the kind of, Nietzsche talked about this, the psychological vitality of the Jewish people, in that like they've created a mythology, a mythos that has just saturates our concepts of morality, life and death, the idea of how like the history works, all this, all the way to modern politics. It's everywhere. It's very, very profound. And it's a big question to turn around and start to say to yourself, well, what if that's not real? Because you can take an argument, you can take a very shocking argument that, Christianity comes into Rome, and what if it was not the truth, but it was an effective ideological push that took over the Roman Empire, just like communism took over Russia or something like this. And then from Rome, it begins to promulgate itself and push itself into Europe. And so Charlemagne is like this sort of useful Stalin-like character that pushes it on the Germanic people and then pushes it up into the Lithuanians. And this is something that I might be able to contribute quite a lot to, because I know a lot about this. And Christianity is just drenched in blood. There was so many murders and massacres and wars and fights.
And they bragged about it in the Song of Roland.
Well, they brag about it a lot. Yeah, the Darkening Age is a good book about it as well. And even like, reading about Lithuania, which was only conquered in like around about the time of the Vikings. So this is really recently,
Right.
And it was just ruthless the way that all this type of stuff was happening. So these are really fascinating questions, because then you say to yourself, well, we give over to Christianity the authority of morality, the authority of the truth. Like I would point out, for example, that Tacitus, a pagan writer, went to Germany and discovered that the Germans were monogamous while they were pagan. This is long before Christianity existed. Now, these type of things are enormous problems, because you will go and you'll speak to a modern Christian and they'll say, because people drifted away from Christianity, they are now all having polygamous relationships and being very immoral and becoming sterile. But then you say to them, wait a second,
right?
If the ancient Germans were monogamous and doing all this stuff, where does morality come from? Like, is it
even going deeper than that? This is amazing what you just said right there, because people there's this myth that Rome and Greece were like super pagan, and everybody was like having orgies in honor of Dionysius and Aphrodite, and there really was no morality, and everyone was just running around doing whatever they wanted, and no one really cared about ethics and morality and aesthetics and that kind of thing. And then Christianity came along with their monks and their bishops, and they civilized everybody. It's like, no, read the pre-Socratics. By the way, Nietzsche's first book he ever wrote, called Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks. Have to read this book. It's one of my favorite books. He goes through all these pre-Socratic philosophers like Thales and Parmenides and Heraclitus and Anaxagoras and so on, and how these people really brought a lot of Western morality and philosophy and ethics and all these ideas. You find them way before Christianity in the Stoics, in the Aristotelian Peripatetic school, in the Platonist schools, even like the Cynic schools. They all have their own morality and ethics that they're all and even the Dionysian cults that get all this bad rap for like carrying phalluses and having orgies. Even in those cults, they had a very strict moral ethic code that they followed, and even though their rituals were sort of bizarre and out there, in their regular daily lives they followed moral codes. Dionysius is called Thesmophoria, the lawbringer. So there was a balance there that people don't talk about. So it's like this idea that pagans were just all these wild animalistic people and Christianity came and civilized everyone is completely backwards. It's not true.
Yes, and this is it, like the academic insufficiency of it. I shouldn't be trying to sound smart when I can't even pronounce the word, but it's very, very poor understanding of history. For example, the word morality comes from pagan Rome, where they had this word called moralis, or the sort of habits of the people, and that's basically morality. You read through it and it's like that's morality. The word virtue is a Roman pagan word. The Pontifex Maximus, the Pope, was a station for the ancient Roman pagan church, these types of things. So there was something before, and this is again kind of like where we start to get to these very difficult questions, because you say to yourself, if I want to reach morality, if I want to ground myself against the madness of the modern world, if I want to achieve health, people will say, well, all I have is Christianity. That is tradition. That is the only direction I can go in order to get fertility and health and life. But what if There was something before that worked perfectly fine. There was morality there. There was architecture. They built a Colosseum. There was great empires. There was order, families. The word patriarchy comes from Rome. You know, like all of these social styles are all there. And people are trying to strawman Christianity as the only option. And why do they do that? Because of something that happened 2,000 years ago in Rome. Now, I want to go over to Adam to kind of dig into what he knows about this, because this is probably a good time to get into Jesus.
And I just want to say something real quick on that, and then go to Adam.
Okay.
Not only that, Christianity is drawing from those philosophical schools and then claiming that this is their contribution to society. Yeah. Christians still today, you get Daily Wire hosts will talk about how Judeo-Christianity is what influences the Bill of Rights and the Constitution and the democratic republics of America. It's like, hell no. Read the Founding Fathers, read Thomas Paine. They were going back to the old Roman Republic ideal
that
you find in Cicero. So there you go.
Well, these are very important points, and again, it's this thing about knowledge and authority, because it's sort of a motif you'll hear me say an awful lot, where the religion is used to give authority. And it's like, Ben Shapiro, for example, will say, it's like, listen, you conservative American, you actually need me to tell you the moral way through the world. And Jordan Peterson and all them do their round table, and they pull out the Bible and they go through it. And like Jordan Peterson's very guilty of this. And it's really bad, because it's like a kind of castrated version of historical knowledge, because he is very smart and he knows an awful lot about Europeans and he knows an awful lot about Christianity, and Christianity has a lot of wonderful things in it, without doubt. But then there's this idea that like all foundations of individuality and morality came out of the Bible. The Bible gave it all to us. And in order for a conservative American, for example, to ground themselves in Western tradition, they must sit and listen to this round table reading the Bible back to them. And like, there's so many problems with that, because as you said, the concept of the citizen came from Greco-Roman pagan history. The whole idea of the individual comes from them. It's not from Christianity. These are big problems. But I guess the biggest problem of all, and this is a very serious one, I think, related to Jordan Peterson, comes from Jung, because Jung would speak about these type of topics often as well. But he was actually very pro-Christian, and for one specific reason. It's that it's a question of health. Because if you look at the modern world, one of the biggest problems with the modern world is that you get you get kind of mentally sick. You actually literally can end up wounding yourself in order to ally with the morals of the modern world. You can cut your genitalia off and things like this. And so sickness is a big problem in the modern world. Depression, sickness, insanity. And Jung would point out that like Christianity is like in our psychology. Just whatever happened in those 2,000 years, good or bad, it's there. And it has an enormously stabilizing force upon people's psyche. And to the point where like Christ is like the word Jesus Christ, the concept Jesus Christ, and the sort of figure of Jesus Christ, it's almost like an egregore that does have stabilizing psychological power for people. And an awful lot of people I notice who go back to Christianity, they do it in response to like traumas in their life. They might have a parent die, or they might even come in touch with, like, this is a very difficult psychological problem as well. Like you read, for example, about evil. You go study like how people get tortured, or how governments, for example, run MK Ultra and all this, and it's like there's people out there who are twisted and they actually destroy people. They like intentionally want to hurt people, and that really scars people when they come across that in their life. And Christ represents to them a sort of innocent, glorious soul that they can attach to. It's like, it is literally like a godlike figure that helps them feel saved. And you often hear people speak this way, and I think there's something very functionally real to this. But then there's this other enormous problem, because in order to accept Christ and Christianity, it's like you take the apple and the whole tree comes with it. Like, in order to accept Christ, you have to accept the totalitarian thesis of Judeo-Christianity, if you so will. And so this is where we get to a very scary problem, a very, very difficult problem, is what if Christ is not real? Because the kind of verification for Christ is that all these prophecies came around him, and they verified that he's a real guy and he fulfilled them all, and history proved it. That's where the authority comes from. All these prophets, the Jews, they were generating these prophecies and created this concept of this man, and it came true. So the Jewish prophets were definitely, the prophets of Israel were definitely prophets. They were definitely in touch with God, and God revealed this character, and he was unique among all of human history, and that's where it landed, right there in Judea in that particular time. And I've been listening to Adam, and Adam's been going through the scholarship to argue that this was way more. There's much more to this story than we might see. So, Adam, based on what I'm saying, how would you start? For example, like I from what I understand, you make it seem like there was actually a lot of like magician sort of intellectuals, almost like poets or
mystical, not magician.
I should say mystical.
I don't believe anybody has supernatural powers, but yes, Gnostic Christianity is basically there was many sects of Judaism. Some of them were believing in this mystical Messiah. I think that's how it originated. But really, I think the debate boils down to most scholars will acknowledge that in the New Testament, all these prophecies fulfilled didn't really happen, that they were followers of Jesus. They thought he was the Messiah. He was crucified. And then maybe they had visions, and then they started searching the scriptures to find proofs that he was the Messiah. Okay. But I think it's way better explained. We already know that ancient Jews at this time were obsessively scouring all the scriptures, connecting different verses midrashically, creating pesherim stories. And we know they were doing this, that we see this in the Dead Sea Scrolls. We have all the Apocrypha and Nag Hammadi, and they're no different than the canonical Gospels. They were all just creating myths, symbolic, allegorical myths from ancient scriptures, blending them with other memes and motifs at the time as well.
So let me ask a question.
Sort of updating the software a little bit.
Well, I'm going to have to really dig into this again, just to make it accessible. So, the way I would frame this in my mind is I'm imagining lots of, it's almost like the way comic books are made, lots of people writing, or guys on the internet making memes or something like that.
Memes. Yeah, it's a developing meme of a Messiah.
So there's like
mixing the Son of Man, the Logos, wisdom ideas, suffering Messiah ideas, high priest Melchizedek ideas, and they were all kind of blended and syncretized. And it's really like a literary genius what they were able to compile, and to see how effective it's been throughout so long. So, it definitely was the greatest success and the greatest story, that's influenced more than any other.
Just 1 second, Neil. 1 second, Neil. So let me finish my thoughts here. So I want to set the context for the audience, for example. So this happens in ancient Rome. So and Rome is this massive empire. It's like America, and these guys are like, the Judeans are like outside of Rome. So you can think of it like, I'm Irish, and you can imagine like a load of Irish poets writing propaganda in order to like frame the British Empire as like this ugly, horrible, monstrous thing. Whereas the British, obviously, the memes they put out are like, the Brits are the best ever, and they create civilization, they propagate it out into the world. But us Irish, we would have been scribbling in our books, and we're saying like, these arrogant, monstrous Brits, they want to genocide us all and steal our potatoes, this type of thing. So it's kind of a little bit like that context. We have a load of Jews who have been in Judea, they've been conquered, and they're like guys on Twitter, they're writing about it, and they're in Photoshop, and they're generating memes, and they're grabbing onto these concepts. You listed a lot of different concepts, and again, these are like this type of jargon. My audience probably won't be up to date with it. So they're generating concepts like the Son of Man, and you've spoke about, for example, Edom, and the categorization of the West and Rome as Edom and things like this. Maybe if you could go through some of those and tell me if this picture I'm painting is correct.
Well, yeah, I would say the best way to start is to see that they originally blended the Son of Man that you find in Daniel. Like, I completely agree with Neil about the dating. It's a forgery, basically. Daniel is, but that was one of the biggest apocalyptic books. It has a timetable for a messianic expectations. And you're right. There was outsiders. There was like, there was many different sects of Judaism and all different types of messianic apocalyptic thought. And you would have sects in Alexandria, Egypt. You have Dead Sea Scrolls, which were outsiders from in Jerusalem as well. And there were different Messiah memes. And I think, just like Paul says, all the oldest layers of the New Testament that we have, and all of the earliest writings outside of the Bible, the farther back you go, the more of a celestial, mythical Jesus that you find. Like in Hebrews and Paul's letters, it's not till later on in the Gospels they had incentive to euhemerize Jesus, because you have more authority if there were people that supposedly actually knew and followed him. But Paul never knew Jesus. He says that he learned about him from revelation, from reading scripture. Says explicitly he learned about the gospel of Jesus not from any man, but just from his own visions, apparently. And he goes, "Am I not also apostle? Have I not also seen the Lord?" So I think that completely gives away that the first apostles, James, Cephas, John, whoever, the 12, which also could be, there's an Essene group of 12 in the community scroll, the Dead Sea Scrolls. So I think it developed mystically reading the scriptures. Paul explicitly says he was caught up into the third heaven where he learned to paradise, which is like Merkava mysticism. Epiphanius talks about there's a lost book of the Ebionites called the Ascents of James. There's all of this. There's the Apocalypse of James where he gets like a Gnostic wisdom kiss, or it's handed over to him. They claim he's the brother. That's like the greatest source that they have, is Paul saying he's the brother of Jesus. But I think it was the Christians before Paul believed in a celestial, mythical Jesus that did this hidden sacrifice, tricking Satan. He was hidden, and this happened mystically in heaven. And then just later they historicized the character because it was more effective.
Okay, so this is very fascinating. So and again, I'm really going to try set the stage to make this accessible. So I'm imagining ancient Judea, it's the desert, hot out there, all this type of stuff. And you're describing that there's like factions spread across the Levant. So like there's one in Israel where the Dead Sea Scrolls are now. And this is like a little group of lads. Like, you know, it's a little sub-community on Twitter or Reddit forum, you know, but they're actually in real life and they live out somewhere and they write. And they're into writing and they talk about philosophy. And then there's one in Alexandria in Egypt, for example, you're talking about as well. And these guys, they get together and they're sort of like, you know, they're like monks in a weird way. And then they start to think to themselves, what is the nature of the world? And what is the purpose of history? And what is happening? So they ask these questions that we all do when we philosophize and all this.
When is the Messiah going to come and redeem them from their occupiers is mostly what they were thinking about.
So the occupiers would be Rome, for example. So they
Greece and then Rome, yeah.
Okay, so they're dealing with the kind of like classic problem. It's as Nietzsche would talk about this, you know, slave morality. They deal with this classic problem. I say like the Irish and the English. Us Irish are sitting there. We've got these Brits. They're in our country, and we're thinking to ourselves, when do we get rid of these guys? How do we solve these guys? And so the general fantasy that comes up is that like a Superman is going to rise up, and he's going to be a super conquering general like King David, and he's going to charge at them, and he's going to defeat them, and then we're going to be free. That's the kind of basic thing. And so you have these subreddits, you know, sprinkled across the Middle East, and they've been dreaming up. They're kind of it's almost like fantasy. So they're fantasizing and saying to themselves, "Hey, we want a Messiah. We want this type of character in Messiah." So you're sort of saying that you actually can trace these fantasies, and they start off as like they just begin as this basic fantasy. I wish a Messiah would come. I hope King Arthur comes again. I hope Donald Trump comes and saves me. You know, I hope a president comes in the future who's going to save me. I hope Julius Caesar shows up again. So it's this type of like fantasy. It turns into something very sort of celestial, if you will. And then over time, it begins to actually consolidate into the idea of a real man in history. And maybe even wraps around him or something like that. Because Carl Jung said something similar, by the way. But I just want to know, is the story correct and how you understand it?
Absolutely. And you can see remnants of this in the New Testament also. It says they say you're an antichrist if you're a Christian that doesn't say Jesus came in the flesh, and they're having to deny that that it's Jesus is a cleverly devised story as well. So in the whole fight early on, it makes way more sense that there was many different motifs in this milieu of, like, you know, messianic expectations. And we have all these different, they're called Gnostic groups, but they didn't call themselves Gnostics. They consider themselves Christians, basically, or like following the way. Even the first Christians didn't even call themselves Christians, right? So
yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that, again, like, just to make this relatable to people, you think about it psychologically. You think about it from the perspective of these guys. You know, they're little subreddit groups, little monks, and they're living under occupation. And they feel in themselves the feeling that everybody would under occupation. It's like, why does my life suck? You're like, why do I suffer? The fundamental human question. Why is life hard? What is going on? And they fantasize and hope for an escape of some sort. And because of their religion, because of Christianity, or I should say Judaism, it offers them this tradition of stories about, like, you know, the prophets of Judaism say that a Messiah will come and he will finally defeat Edom or whatever it is. He'll finally defeat the enemies of the Judeans. You know, this is the kind of fantasy. So it'd be like us maybe in the West saying like Caesar's going to come soon and he's finally going to defeat all these globalists who are holding down the West, this type of thing. It's that same type of thinking that you see inside of people. And so I guess, Adam, what you seem to be pointing out is that, and we know this obviously from the recently discovered Nag Hammadi Bibles. So these are things that showed up in Egypt in the 1940s that revealed actually that there was a diverse array of cults, and they had this very heavy slant on this feeling like this world is evil, I am trapped, the Romans run the world, these Romans are violent thugs, I want to escape, how do we defeat them? And then it's like, Yahweh God, why don't you overthrow the Romans and empower us and we'll make the world good? It's like sort of how
and some of those Nag Hammadi texts are actually blaming Yahweh God for the situation.
Oh yeah, true, yeah. Well, just this general thesis of like, all right, the divine source save me, this type of thing. So is that's the kind of like context you're seeing, Adam?
Yeah, that's about right. And it's interesting. Irenaeus, one of the early church fathers, he said that all of the Gnostic heresies were not true stories about Jesus, but his argument was because the canonical gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were really written by eyewitnesses and followers of Jesus. And we now know that not to be true. So really, there's no difference between the canonical traditions and the, extra biblical Nag Hammadi or there's Fourth Ezra, there's all these other ideas. Yeah, go ahead.
Because Thomas is one of these gospels that people just kind of cast aside. But Thomas is probably, in my opinion, I don't know if you agree with it, I think it's the oldest one. Thomas does have these Gnostic elements, if you want to call it that, where there's a lot of mystery sayings, and in this particular text, Jesus is the son of a different god called Barbello in a different higher realm of heaven. But the thing that gets me, this is why people want to date it to the 2nd century. I think this has been proven to be incorrect. To date it, if there's Gnostic elements, you want to go back even earlier, in my opinion, because that's when you find the so-called Gnostic bishops or whoever they were, the elders in the church, Basilides, Simon Magus, Carpocrates. Those guys were living towards the end of the 1st century, early 2nd century. And then by the middle of the 2nd century, all those guys are done. They're now becoming heretics. So to me, Thomas I think is probably the oldest one. And the main reason for that is because it's got the skeleton bones of what we find in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's just the sayings. It's just the parables. And there's no emphasis on the fleshly return of Jesus at all. And so this is big. Paul's letters are the oldest. In Paul's letters, he appears to Cephas, then to someone else, and then to 500. Never says anything about a flesh, about it being touched by Thomas. There's no emphasis on the flesh at all. Next, and then I think Thomas is written after that. The next gospel to be written is not Matthew, it's Mark. Mark becomes about 10 to 15 years before Matthew does. Mark's the oldest of the 4 canonical gospels. Guess what happens in Mark? In the oldest manuscripts that we have of Mark, anyone can fact check me on it. This is scholarly consensus. What I'm about to say, everyone agrees on this. Even Christian scholars will agree with me on this. The good ones, like Gary Habermas, whoever you want to pick, they're all going to agree with me on this. The oldest manuscripts of Mark, which is the first gospel in the Bible, the oldest, which it's not shown first. Matthew's shown first. To me, that's a deception. They throw Matthew in front to make you think Matthew's the oldest, but it's not. Mark's the oldest. Now check this out. The oldest manuscripts of Mark that we have that date from, late 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and all the way to the 5th century, the first 300-400 years of Christianity, the physical copies that we have of Mark don't have the last chapter when he appears to the disciple. It's not there.
No.
And Mark doesn't have the birth narrative either. It doesn't have the nativity.
There's no Joseph either. No Joseph. Now check this out. Now, why does this matter? It actually plays into what Adam is saying about the emphasis on a fleshly risen Jesus. In Mark's ending, first of all, it conflicts with what Paul says. Paul says he first appeared to Cephas. Well, Mark is saying that he first appears to Mary. That's odd. And he doesn't even appear really. An angel appears for him and tells Mary that he rose. She never gets to see him. Nobody ever sees Jesus in the oldest gospel.
No,
it's not until around 85 to 95 AD, when Matthew gets written, is when they finally start to emphasize a fleshly, and that Matthew might even be older or might even be later than that. Some scholars are saying it might be 2nd century when Matthew gets written. And that's when you start getting the emphasis on a physical return of Jesus, when you get Thomas, doubting Thomas, who touches Jesus.
Now, so this is some, this is where we start to get hardcore. So first of all, just to point out something that Neil's doing, and this is something Adam is great at as well, is like, all right, we have this problem. It's epistemology. We have this problem of evidence. Like, how do we prove any of this stuff? And so what scholars tend to do is they tend to try to do literature analysis. It's very difficult to go back 2,000 years and assess reality. In fact, Nietzsche's job was a philologist who would look through literature and try to assess what is real and what is true. He's very good at it. This is where he came up with genealogy of morals. So what Gnostic is doing is something that's big in scholarship, and it's really shocking, because you look through and you can do all sorts of things with old documents. You can say, all right, what's the timeline? What's the oldest one? And what do they contain? So as Neil's saying, like, all right, the oldest gospels, they're missing the part with the redemption at the end, and that's a pretty big deal. It's a really big deal. And then like another version of this would be you look at language writing styles. So it's almost like slang, a certain slang word shows up and then you're like, you could date that to the 1980s. If people start saying like based, if people look back in our time and people are saying based, they're like, oh, that was clearly in the 2010s plus. So there's this kind of capacity of language to date things quite well. And people are good with this, and writing styles and like the way that language is constructed, and even things like parchment, there'd be like a way that you write a piece, you make a parchment out of like goat skin, and that was something people only did in like the 1st century and all this. So there's actual very hard ways to be scientific, to be knowledgeable about what we're dealing with here. So this idea that Neil presented, again, you can look all this stuff up yourself. It's quite hardcore. You're seeing that Christ's story slowly gets modulated as time goes on, and the Gospels, which get consolidated into the Catholic Church's Bible, is not the canonical way it was put together. That's obviously what we were told is authoritative, but in fact it was actually slowly constructed in a different way. And Mark is I think it's called M document. Mark references actually a gospel that we don't have, and people think that was the
Q.
Q. Oh, interesting.
Yeah, but I don't believe in Q.
Some people think Thomas might be another version of Q because it's just sayings.
Yeah.
I mean, read Tom. By the way, I said Barbello. That's actually the Apocrypha of John. But those two are very close together in the fact that emphasis on a spiritual Jesus.
Okay.
And then it lines up with his parables talking about a spiritual kingdom too. There's no physical kingdom. It's a spiritual kingdom within you.
Well, let me grab onto that, because again, Nietzsche, the Antichrist, talks about precisely that like Christianity is misunderstood if you don't understand that a lot of what Jesus was doing was making essentially a psychological doctrine to help people essentially with like their internal world, which is Gnosticism, but let's maybe put that aside until a little bit later and go to something I've heard Adam talk about quite a bit, which is that, like the kind of thesis and frame here. This is where it starts to get a little bit intense, because
let me say something on that real quick, because there's another thing that comes up. We get lucky where there's things that happen in history that allow us to test our epistemology. And real quick, and I'll throw it back to Adam just real quick. One of the examples of this, and the reason why people are like, how do you know that the Torah is really Hellenistic? How do you know that the prophets aren't really from like 600, 700 BC? How do you know? And I go, well, there's a way we can test this. And that's Elephantine, the city where the Jews fled from the wrath of Nebuchadnezzar, and they settled in this city for 200 years. And we have thousands of papyri that have survived to this day from that city. So we're talking about from 597 BC all the way until 400 BC, right? 200 years, 197 years. And what do we find there? No Moses, no Abraham, no Noah, no Torah.
No.
Are you kidding me? That's supposed to be the Judean culture.
No.
And so people will say that's an argument from silence. No. That's like not finding a radio station if you have a ham radio. You're supposed to be able to find a religious culture, and it's not there.
Yeah.
To me, this is like the slam dunk evidence. But what I'm getting at is there's ways we can test this stuff, and sometimes in the New Testament stuff we can test it as well by looking at what people are saying. early on, like Paul.
Yep.
Anyways, throw it back to
Okay,
you.
well, let's grab. So, like, as we see, this is the kind of like literary criticism and the techniques for trying to verify truth. And it's a very interesting conversation. Like, how do you verify truth? Something that is in our hands, and scholars are hacking away at it. And these two gentlemen here are very, very good at like actually studying what people are saying and asking themselves, is this good evidence? So the thesis here is actually obviously quite an interesting one. First of all, the story of Christ modulates. Now, what does it modulate from? That's the fucking question. Excuse my French. What does it modulate from? And Adam and Gnostic are pointing out that it begins psychological. It begins spiritual. It's symbolic, you know? Like, it's like kind of starting something like, you know, hey, Adam, you want to save the West? Be more like Caesar, you know? And it's sort of like a psychological concept. Be stronger, be powerful. They're giving you a story. And Christianity begins a little bit like this, you know, it's like there's the Messiah is going to be the savior, and then he comes, and it's this like this thing. You come in, and the Messiah is this feeling of overcoming depression inside of yourself or something like this. And it's very sort of it's spiritual, which means psychological. It's mental, if you want to think about it this way. And that actually seems to be the beginning of it. It's a religious sort of mental experience, almost like maybe something that happens inside of your mind. But as time goes on, it seems like it consolidates and transforms into something tactile and real. The problem is that this happens after the alleged story of Jesus, which is a very weird pattern for people to see. So I believe that's the thesis. Adam, maybe if you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, Neil mentioned earlier about putting on his tinfoil hat and talking about the biblical studies and academia and stuff. And I agree. He had a really good interview with PhD Dr. Richard C. Miller, who said that we're still in the vestiges, the last remnants of the Dark Ages when it comes to biblical studies. It's still highly influenced by religious thoughts, and the Abrahamic academics are still influencing the zeitgeist, I notice. And there's incentive to protect the sacred myths of society. There's definitely a lot of incentive still for that. And I do agree about the Alexandrian Greek creation of the Septuagint and the dating of the Torah and when it was repackaged and constructed based on Plato's noble lie. And then that extended out and branched out through Christianity and Islam, which is another form of the noble lie. And it's all predicated on the idea of like the supremacy of Yahweh, the monotheistic God. The whole main goal is to have all of the world believe in that one God, all flesh. And that's through the Messiah. And you can clearly see, how did we get Christianity and all of this apocalyptic prophecy belief? It's through their interpretation of the Old Testament. And they're scouring all the scriptures for related ideas. They think this is taught. They think, oh, the servant and the branch and the rod, that's the Messiah. Anything about the David and the Psalms, that's the Messiah. So they're reading Daniel, they're reading Isaiah, they're reading Zechariah, Wisdom of Solomon, the Psalms, and looking for their mystical Jesus from the scriptures, like it's a divine puzzle, and they can pick different things. And with the right interpretation, they can learn the mysteries that have been hidden by God. And I see it as, and then they took through Paul, they took it to the Gentiles because they saw from reading the scriptures that it was meant to go to the nations. The nations are meant to put their hope in the Messiah. Like Psalms 110 says that the rod will rule in the land of thine enemies. That's what the Messiah was intended to do. So I see it as a form of religious warfare, basically. And so for like religious theological warfare and like the supremacy of the God of Israel is like the overall scriptures, the script, their end game that they desire according to the prophecies.
By the way,
just 1 second, Neil. So I'd love to expand on that then a little bit as well, because this is fascinating then. So it's like saying to yourself that these groups, these meme guys, they're essentially doing meme warfare of some sense, which is almost like a version of psychological warfare. So you've got like all these guys, these monks in their little monasteries in the Dead Sea or in Alexandria, Egypt, and Rome is here, and they are trying to think to themselves, how do I get the Romans, which is the people? How do I get the Romans to how do we dismantle Rome? and make them subservient, not necessarily to us, but this idea of like Rome has all the power right now and we need to break that up. It's an evil empire that we don't want. And so the kind of thesis goes is that like our God, Yahweh, we're the chosen people of the true God, Yahweh, and he is in control of history. And he has a plan to radically transform the world and lift us up and give us the kingdom of heaven, which is this, you know, the world is ruled by us, which would be a moral world. Because I like to think of the idea that these people think that they're the righteous people. This is how all people tend to frame themselves in their heads. And so they're like, all right, we want Yahweh to win, and he's in control of history, so he will win. And his plan is to fix this broken world that we live in and give us a moral world. And what we need in order for this to happen is we need everyone to move to, and listen to Yahweh and become subservient to Yahweh and let Yahweh into their hearts and abandon their other gods. And if we can get Rome to do that, Rome just evaporates off the face of the earth, because if they all turn to Yahweh, that means Jupiter dies, you know, we basically get rid of that problem, this type of thing. And so this becomes this like grand project of the Israelites, if you will, that they're working hard in order to generate memes and generate sort of like a psychological package that they can.
But it's interesting you said that though, because
put it into people's heads.
We can find in the Roman period, the Roman Republic period, there is text. One of them I think on the top of my head is Valerius Maximus, who wrote an epitome.
Hilarious Maximus, is that his name?
Valerius.
Totally hilarious.
He actually says that the Jews living in Rome equated their god Yahweh with Jupiter.
Saturn was not.
Jupiter Sabazius. So Jupiter Sabazius, Saba has the Saba in there, and there. So they're trying to latch themselves on and do sort of what the Greeks did with other. So let me take this back for a second. This is all about the meme warfare stuff, right? Homer is the first one to master this. Homer writes these stories about the Mediterranean world, and these heroes are going around and they're visiting all these cities. And what happens is these cities are now a part of something. So when Odysseus visits Thebes, all of a sudden the Thebans are like, oh, we're part of the story. So they become big Homer fans. And then you find in the archaeology, they all have Homer relics in their houses and stuff. And they're all sacrificing bulls the way Homer says to do it.
So it's like Hollywood or rock and roll, you know, like if it's strong enough, people are like,
Hollywood is doing it right now. Hollywood is the new mythology scripture center of the world, because it's influencing people's minds.
Yeah.
People are living their lives based on what they hear in music and film, and it dictates. And me and I was talking to Richard Spencer about this, actually, about how Euripides' Bacchae, which was performed around 405 BCE, happens to have happened a year before the 30 tyrants are ripped out of power and they replaced it back with democracy again. And Euripides' Bacchae is about Dionysius defeating Pentheus, who's a tyrant. So when you're thinking, whoa, did Euripides influence the people to start a rebellion? Maybe. I think that's a fair hypothesis. But to get back to what we have with the Jews, during this time period, we got to think of what's going on in the 3rd century BCE. Ptolemy just he was placed into Egypt after Alexander sweeps to the east. Ptolemy is in control of Egypt now. So Ptolemy is creating memes in Egypt, not just for Judea, but he's also creating the Serapis religion. The Serapis religion is syncretizing all these Greco-Roman, or not Roman yet, but Mediterranean stories, and it's applying it to Serapis. The story of Serapis is fascinating. Plutarch and Tacitus both say that Serapis is a mixture of Asclepius, Pluto, Dionysus, and Osiris rolled into one god, Serapis. And this is like a god that's like this. So you get this like sort of like resetting of these memes into this new Serapis thing. Serapis becomes huge in Pergamum, and it connects Pergamum to Egypt in a way where they're trading together. Their cultures are the same. And so Ptolemy has his rule over not just Egypt, but he has influence over Pergamum in the north. But then he's also commissioning these Jews because they conquered Israel. Ptolemy defeats Antigonus and his son Demetrius, and they had a battle over Judea in Gaza. The war happened in Gaza. There's so many wars in Gaza in history. It's nuts. Gaza is just like a war zone forever. It's like an eternal war zone. You'll see if you look up God's wars in Gaza, there's hundreds of them. Anyways, this was one of them. It happened right around 310 BCE, where Ptolemy defeats Demetrius in in Gaza. And there's a funny story about it where Ptolemy, because they used to be friends, they used to be generals under Alexander. And so Ptolemy wins, and he arrests Demetrius, brings him into his tent, and he's like, I'm not going to kill you, dude. This is just basically, it's like a Game of Thrones scene where he's like, it's just a game. All right, take your men and go. But this is he wins the war. He wins the war, but he lets Demetrius go, as if like we're all Macedonians playing this Game of Thrones together. It's kind of a cool story, but it shows the power of Greeks had over the world at this time.
Mm-hmm.
All the powers are kind of like together on this one. Anyways, the point I'm making is, you had this new land called Israel. You own it now. What do? Well, we need a mythology to sort of like lay claim to this land. And so you commission these elders to use whatever myths you have floating around, and we're going to take Plato's laws, we're going to fuse them together, and this is where you get the Old Testament. There's actually incentive. It makes sense why this would happen. By the way, this is not like the Jews themselves will tell you that's how the Septuagint was created. It took 70 elders. This is what Aristobulus says. This is what Philo says. This is what Josephus says. There's a couple other people said. We have a letter from Aristeas. And there's
Adam, your mic is
it's clearly a mythological story though about the creation of the Septuagint.
I'm gonna get to that. So the story, it's a total myth. It's just like the Serapis myth.
But it's is there like a reflection of something that might have actually sort of happened in a way?
Right. But let me compare these two, because they both happened in the same decade, in the 270s BCE. You have a story about Serapis giving a dream to Ptolemy, says, go and get my statue. It's from Sinope in Turkey. Bring it to Egypt and build a serapeum around it. And so he goes, and it's a miraculous story where he sends his men into Turkey. They find the statue. The statue gets up and walks, gets on a boat, and brings itself into Ptolemy. And that's where you get Serapis from. So it's a miracle story. But then in the same decade, you get another miracle story where Ptolemy is commissioned 70 high priests of Israel to come to Alexandria and recite the Torah for the Greeks. And then they're like, well, how come no one's ever heard of these stories? Hecataeus says, it's because they're so holy that only few people know this. So they're sort of admitting that this is a brand new thing that no one knows about. Okay. But anyways, the miracle is they took 70 elders, put them in different rooms, and they all recited the same Torah.
Okay, right.
Now, think about this. This sounds like propaganda.
Yeah.
This sounds like a miracle story used to justify, well, this is our land, and the God said so. God said so. And by the way, not only is it our land now, it's always been that way since Moses, since 1,000 years before us, a guy you've never heard about till just now. But we have written scriptures that go back to 1300 BCE. And some unnamed pharaoh, doesn't even say pharaoh, what the name of the pharaoh is.
Just Pharaoh, yeah.
Just Pharaoh, right. And we know, so we have claim to this land from 1,000 years ago. It's our land. We don't care what you say. We're taking it over.
Oh, my God. Oh, my God. Adam, you're going to say something there. I want to go into that, but I'd love your thoughts there.
Well, we know that the Septuagint doesn't match with the Hebrew translations also. So that's the whole story of it. 70 is a highly significant number in Judaism as well. And Neil should probably name drop. He's been doing a lot of interviews with some of the scholars that have this theory of the dating and the actual origins of the Torah and the Tanakh. What are some of them, like Gomurkin and some of the recent ones you've had on?
Gomurkin's the one he's written peer-reviewed books, peer-reviewed by Copenhagen International, about Plato's influences on the Torah and also the dating of the Hebrew Bible being around in the 200s BCE. But it's not even theories. We're talking about what's the evidence that we have, and there's just no evidence of a Torah before 300 BCE. Well, and then it gets even worse than that. Jonathan Adler says they write the stories in the 200s BCE, but it's not until the Maccabees, Hasmonean dynasty in the 150s when they start to actually practice circumcision and the outlaw pork. There's no evidence of circumcision before 150.
No, I want to actually again help the audience a little bit, just get context on this, because this is like you guys are just so like sharp and all this type of stuff. It might go over some people's heads. So dates, when people throw dates, it usually just confuses people quite a bit. So you hear Neil mention the Maccabees, and you hear Neil say like 270 BC and stuff like this. So let's try anchor this a little bit.
Yeah.
Ancient Greece, think of 400 BC is when you have the likes of, the kind of
Socrates, Plato.
The wonderful moment where theater appears, the arrival of Greek. And this is when Nietzsche...
Yeah, by the way, Euripides, Socrates, and Plato were all alive in the same time in the early 400 or late 400s.
Late 400s. And so you have that kind of like bulk where Athens has its wonder moment, okay? Alexander the Great comes at the end of that. So Aristotle trained Alexander the Great. So Alexander the Great then goes and conquers everywhere. So this is the timing of this. Now, this is weird, man, because if you think of the Bible, you would surely say to yourself, no, wait a second. The Bible's telling a historical story that happened thousands of years before this. But no, not at all. Not at all. What we're looking at with the scholarship is that it only really begins to flicker into like, the hard evidence, all right, to give it its fair due, only really begins to flicker in around about 270. So that's after Alexander. And so the theory which Neil is presenting here, which is a very interesting one to explore, is that Alexander the Great conquers the whole world, as we know. But what is the world he conquers? Well, he conquers Iran, Iraq, Israel, Jerusalem, all this type of stuff.
Afghanistan.
He swoops across all of this. And the idea then is that Alexander conquers this and he creates Hellenism. He creates the giant territory, which is like the American Empire. You can think about it this way or something. And in the middle of that, a group of people have a country essentially they conquer. So these would be the Maccabees. They take a chunk out of this after. Remember, Alexander the Great creates the Hellenic world. It begins to implode, and then it splits up. And then at that point, there's probably like free reign where you can grab a little bit of territory. You could grab like Northern Ireland or something like this. And so these guys called the Maccabees, warrior Chads, they seize a piece of this. And then the idea is sort of like these guys say, well, we need a religion. We need a story to justify this. We need propaganda. We were after winning territory. We now need propaganda to make sure all these people that live here do this. And so this is the idea that they actually invented the Torah, Moses, the Bible. They invented all this stuff at this point. That's a very shocking idea, but people are proposing this stuff. And like, there's even freaky evidence about this. I believe.
And by the way, Elephantine is the big anchor. Because people ask, how can you test this? Papyri doesn't last long. How do you know the papyri is gone, but the texts were there? Okay. And like I said, Elephantine is the way we test this. Yeah. Like I said, for 200 years, the Jews are down there, and they have a temple of Yahweh, Yahweh they call him, but they don't have no stories of Moses, Abraham, or Noah anywhere. In all the thousands of texts we have, they never mention.
God.
And those texts last until the earliest one, the last one we have from Elephantine is a letter from Darius in 410 BCE. And he's just telling them for the first time about the Passover, basically telling them how to do Passover. So before 410 BC, there's no Passover.
Like, lads, so like really think about this in terms of context, because that means that Jesus comes literally 150 years later. Like, it's not a long time. That's literally less time between us and Napoleon. Like, it's that quick. Now
it's like half the size of us and Napoleon almost.
Now, Neil, I have a question, because I know Alexander the Great, there's a story that he came across the Judeans in Jerusalem and he recognized they had a very ancient religion. Now, would the claim be that that's proper? Because that would kind of subvert this story quite enormously.
Yeah, it comes from well, first of all, we find it in Josephus. And then it also shows up in the later manuscripts. Please
tell maybe people who Josephus is, because again,
this is great. This will bring us back to Christianity too. This will be a great dovetail. This is perfect. So Josephus is a late first century author. He was a general in the war against the Romans. He was captured by Titus, brought back to Rome, and became the court historian for the Flavians. He writes volumes and volumes and volumes of Jewish history in Greek for the Romans. Doesn't write it in Hebrew. He writes it in Greek. And he tells us stories and legends that sort of like, he's basically doing what the Ptolemies did. He's sort of like legendizing Jewish history based off of the Old Testament stories. He starts off with Adam and he goes all the way into Alexander the Great and then Caesar, and he ties their two histories together into a very, very propagandistic style of writing. By the way, So this is where you get the legendary Alexander meeting the Jews. There's no sources mentioning this
No.
time period. Yeah, so we have older versions of the Alexander story. Xenophon, for example. There's earlier layers of the Alexander romance that we have like fragments of. There's no this is not in there. This is in the later editions of the Alexander romance from the past the first century. It's like a Roman era story. Anyways, so that legend of Alexander meeting the Jews doesn't really happen.
Oh no.
But listen to this though. Josephus becomes a central text for Christian scholars to justify their history of Christ, because there's a passage in there about Jesus. This is considered to be the oldest passage mentioning Jesus outside of any biblical text. But here's the thing. Remember how I said there's ways we can test things? Elephantine is the way we test the Old Testament, right? Well, here's a kicker. Clement of Alexandria talks about Josephus in depth, and then he says it's a shame that Josephus didn't know anything about Jesus, because that would have been great that we can. What? Wait a minute. Josephus does talk about Jesus. This is a problem. This is telling us that there's an interpolation happening, and we think scholars are pretty sure it's Eusebius is inserting a passage about Jesus in 325 AD to make Josephus mention Jesus, because how can Josephus not know about Jesus?
No way.
That's a
I think
problem.
it was Neil, I'm pretty sure it was Origen that said, that
Origen.
Josephus didn't mention Jesus.
Yeah, I meant Origen. I said Clement of Alexandria, but that's Origen.
And that's the kicker, is that Eusebius
period.
inherited his writings of Josephus from Origen's library. So Origen said Josephus never mentioned it, and then Eusebius is the first one to cite it, and then it's only cited after that. And it's clearly an interpolation. They forged it in there.
Origen never mentions the Josephus patches about Jesus, which is like, why there's no way he would miss this. There's just no way you would miss it. This is your God he's talking about. How are you going to miss that verse? He misses it. And it tells us that at least after Origen, at some point, there are Christian historians and scholars that are doing what they always do. By the way, we know this is happening all over the place. Paul's letters, for example, there's a bunch of forgeries written in Paul's names. Only 7 of them appear to be authentic. Some people even say
Ascension of Isaiah was changed up a lot. Same with Testament of Levi. The Christians would totally change stuff.
Yeah, Mark's the big example. We all know that the oldest manuscripts of Mark, like I mentioned before, they don't have the whole last chapter. They add a whole chapter to Mark. At around 325, it's probably Eusebius doing this, because it's all happening in around 325 AD, which is the time Constantine is Romanizing Christianity. And they're making all their edits at this time period. It's fucking wild. It's crazy. And
they're calling all the Gnostic other sects, all the competing sects, they're calling them heretical. Right. But it's most likely that they were actually the originals, and just the Orthodox was the most influential one, and they stamped out everything else. And if it started as a Gnostic mystical religion, they covered it up, and the historicized sect is the one that won out.
And here's the reason why. What is more palatable for a Roman Empire? Is it a Roman Empire that gets its divine inspiration from the bishops who control everything? Or is it a Roman Empire who says divine inspiration comes from within and anybody can have revelation? Which one are you going to use for your empire? Obviously, the bishops are more palatable. You want a network of bishops like Plato talks about. Plato talks about having a network of overseers, priests, who are in control of everything. Whatever they say goes. And then you're allowed to have papal bulls, for example. You can rewrite your laws in real time, whenever you need it to be, whenever you want. Whereas the Christianity that we get in the 2nd century is way different. You have all these different groups with different leaders, and they're all getting their own revelations, and they're all having their own visions. They're all getting a different Jesus.
It's just like Protestantism in a weird way.
Yes, it's good.
It's actually weirdly like the internet as well, because like you can see this breaking down now, where like all the establishment states are saying like, we want control over the internet, because the free thinking and the free talking is leading people to become conspiracy theorists, and it's leading to revolutions. And it's true, like some people are just filling their heads with the biggest load of nonsense because of the internet. And there are like a lot of destabilizations going on. There are a lot of fake narratives and stuff like this. And the states, it would make sense from the perspective of the state to want this. And that's actually what early Christianity was more like. And they consolidated it then later on.
And what's interesting about this is, like, obviously Caracalla changes the Roman Empire. And I think that's the fall of the Roman Empire. is when there's no more citizenship. It's just a universal idea, and that's the end of Rome. Now we're just talking about a region of the world where it's shared culture, because like it's over at that point. Everyone's a Roman citizen now. Christianity is now the perfect religion for a place like this.
Yes.
Because you have a unifying culture, whereas it's plebeians are on top now. It's good to be a plebeian. It's good to be a slave, because God's going to respect you more because you suffered on this earth, and the rich are the ones who are going to go to hell, and it inverts everything. Whereas the Mithraic religion, so this is the perfect example. This is something that I've realized recently. The old religions, whereas the Dionysian, the bowl is the sacrifice. What is a bowl? A bowl is virility. A bowl is power. A bowl is strength. And the people would actually, the new initiates in the Mithraic cult and the Attis cult and the Dionysian cult would sometimes be washed in the blood of a bull to be initiated. And you see this reflected in Christianity. The Dionysian gets overturned on its head, and now it's a lamb. It's a meek little lamb. Yeah. Be like a lamb. Don't be like a bull. Be like a lamb. Be subservient to your leaders. Be a good servant to your to Rome. Don't worry about conquering and being powerful. Just be a lamb. And so his psychological memes are being produced, and this is what Nietzsche gets into about. You sort of get the social justice mentality of the West from Christianity. And so they're knocking down statues of the old Caesars that they didn't like, Caligula, Nero. All of those are bad. Damn those guys to hell. And they're rewriting their history in a way where they're using Josephus, for example. They're rewriting the history of the world based off what we find in Judeo-Christianity. Wow. And now all of a sudden it's like emperors and conquerors are bad and evil, and people who are rich are evil, whereas the meek are the ones who are going to inherit the kingdom.
Oh my day! Well, let me pull it back a little bit then to just double paint that picture, because there's so much fascinating things here. So what Adam was saying earlier, we have all these Gnostic sects rising up around about the time of Christ's birth and even a little bit afterwards, and these guys are generating memes about like the sort of salvation of the world, which specifically means the dismantling of Roman power in the world, in order to see Yahweh's power rise, which is going to like be the kingdom of heaven, which places these people on top, basically. Now we pull this even further back, but not that much further back, into the days of the Maccabees, which is only like 100 to 150 years before that. And we have a similar context, Hellenic Greek. We have like Alexander the Great Empire, and we have these people, these Maccabees, who seize a bit of territory, and they call up a load of boys, who are like good at making religion. You know, you could basically think of them as like Hollywood directors, like a kind of a version of that. They say, lads, we need to set up we have a little tribe here. We want to set up a nice little cozy religion that gets them to work. And so the Hollywood directors dust off this bog standard best philosophical intellectual work of the time, which is Platonism. That's the best philosophy going around about how to do stuff like this. And they say, no bother guys, this is how we do it. Dust it off. And they create the concept of Moses. They create all of it. So they build the religion there, literally, and develop it there in this, and create Israel and create Judea, basically. And then this becomes a sort of sect that begins to grow. And then by the time the Romans come in and conquer, this sort of sect is there. And this is why the Judeans are known for being like virulent and very, very aggressive fighters. They're constantly rebellious. They're constantly trying to overthrow everything. And they fail, obviously, and Rome destroys Judea then and eviscerates them. But they've still got this sort of like mythos left over now at this point, which is calling for a sort of revolution of the world. So it's almost like, it's like a communist story in a weird way, where it's like we've got to revolutionize the world. We've got to take over the world and destroy all imperial power, destroy all the Christian kings of Europe, as the communists used to say, get rid of all the capitalists, and reform society into a utopia, this type of thing.
And you know what? Real quick, I just hold that thought. I got to jump in for 1 second, because this is such a big thing, and it plays into what Nietzsche's talking about the religion of pity and slave morality coming from both Judaism and Christianity. And I think he's right, is that Judea, or Jerusalem, I should say, is conquered so many times.
Yeah.
By whether it be the Seleucids, the Romans, whoever. It's probably dozens at this point. By the time Ptolemy does it, it was like the 10th time already. By the time Titus conquers them, That's because it happens happens twice between Pompey and what's the last one who does it is not
Trajan,
not Trajan, Hadrian.
Hadrian.
Hadrian is that was the end of the Jews at the end of, but it happened twice in between him and Pompey.
Yeah.
So it happens again with the Jewish revolt with Titus. Anyways, the point I'm trying to make is Jerusalem has been conquered so many times, probably 15 times, in between the time of the Maccabees and Hadrian, that at that point there's like the suffering Messiah is the only thing that makes sense. We're supposed to suffer. So you think they're reflecting through Isaiah, where Isaiah is about them getting conquered, by the way. Whoever wrote Isaiah is writing about the Babylonians conquering the Israelites. But they're taking that motif and they're applying it to Jesus, the suffering Messiah. So they're being conquered so much that they end up thinking this is supposed to happen. We're supposed to suffer. That's the point. And then you get Christianity.
Now, if we're running with this timeline of the Maccabees, for example, being the origin in some sense of Israel, how would Babylon fit into it? Because all of that stuff would come before that. Babylon would be like 500 BC and stuff.
It's not the origin of Israel. It's the origin of Judaism, which is a big distinction. Israel does exist. The kings of Israel do exist.
Okay.
I don't know about David and Solomon. They might be legendary. It's possible there was a King David. It's possible there was a Solomon. I don't really know. But we definitely know that there was a Hezekiah. We definitely know like some of these kings are mentioned in Babylonian text.
Okay.
Like Hezekiah gets conquered. So we know that those kings do exist. We know that Jerusalem is as old as the Bronze Age. Jerusalem is a big city hub in the Bronze Age, mentioned in Egyptian text. So Israel is the north, Judah is the south. Those are real places, and and some of these historical events, such as Nebuchadnezzar sacking Jerusalem, did actually happen. But when we talk about people practicing the religion of the Torah,
okay,
not until way later.
So basically,
They're taking real history and they're mythologizing it.
So what kind of happens is that Israel exists and it gets conquered and wiped out, basically, and maybe they sort of forgot who they were in between that point, or it got like trimmed down. And then we have that city, for example, of Elephantine, where we show that they're talking about Yahweh and stuff like this, but it's not the religion that we would understand as Judaism.
Yeah, they're talking about Jerusalem. They're talking about kings of Israel. They're just not mentioning Moses, Noah, or Abraham at all.
And so
which is the main characters of the first 5 books of Moses.
And so what happens then is that, okay, so these people are real and they have a tradition, but then come the Maccabees in like only 150 BC.
Put it this way.
They consolidate and build a state, and then they say, right, let's create a religion for this. And that's when they actually literally create.
That's when they rewrite their own history. They rewrite their own history.
Wow.
And that's why you notice in Kings and Chronicles, if you notice, there's a theme in Kings and Chronicles. The theme is that there's good kings and there's bad kings. The good kings were subservient to Yahweh only and got rid of the poles of Asherah and got rid of the idols, and the bad kings brought them back. And that's why we kept getting conquered, because we had bad kings. But if we actually look into the archaeological record and the sources from Babylonian texts, from Hittite text, from Mycenaean text, whatever, especially Egyptian text, you find out that there was no monotheistic religion in Jerusalem.
Yeah, it was
pagan. In fact, all the way in 450 BC, late in the game we're talking about, we're almost in the Hellenistic period. We're just about a century before it, right? They're minting coins with other gods on them, Athena and Zeus. So, but what about the Torah saying that you will not make images of any other gods besides me? They're making images of Yahweh too. They don't. There's no 10 commandments yet. They don't have this idea of one God yet. It's not the idea of one God is a way later adaptation, and I think they're being influenced by Platonism and Zoroastrianism, sort of like a double whammy happening, in like one from the east, one from the west. Platonism is monism, pre-Socratic monism through Plato, and Zoroastrian monism through the Magi, and they're sort of getting pounded with these ideas left and right. And I'd say right around 400 BCE is when they start changing up their theologies. They're getting rid of Asherah. They're getting rid of Baal. A lot of these old prophets have Baal in their names.
Yeah.
Yerubbaal, right? You know what I'm saying? Like the Baal is still part of their pantheon. It's part of the theophoric elements of their names. So there's tons of evidence. There's no evidence of circumcision. They have circumcision in Egypt. They have circumcision all the way up in the north, and the Hittites are doing it. But the Jews are not even practicing the thing that they claim that they invented.
Oh my God!
It's not until, like I said, the Maccabees is when they really start practicing this stuff. But it's probably they probably wrote this stuff in the 200s, 300s, something like that. Well, but I want to make that distinction very clear. I'm not saying Israel didn't exist,
Yes.
and that their history isn't real. That history is real. It's just that the idea of Judaism and this sort of unifying culture that unifies this land didn't exist. You have different cults in the north. You have different. There's no 12 tribes that didn't exist. There's no like we're in the tribe of Dan over here. That didn't happen. You just had different cities in Judea and Israel, and they all have different cults, and they're polytheistic. So it's like that's a big deal.
Okay, so that kind of gets put together, and so I guess, Adam, the idea is that the foundation of this essentially this religion. I'm not sure if you agree with this, by the way, but I'm assuming you're pretty much aligned with it. The foundation of this religion then has this almost like resentful relationship with the Hellenic Greek imperial kings and the Romans. And this forms this foundation of like desiring the reformation of the world, which leads into the kind of questions about Christianity. So like, how do you see the kind of like movement from there?
The movement from there, you can see it develop. They date the Dead Sea Scrolls to like basically right after when Daniel was written. And there's a timetable in Daniel, and there's the Son of Man idea, and it's very apocalyptic still to this day. They believe the end times is based on Daniel. So you can see the development of the Dead Sea Scrolls. All of these motifs and ideas that Christians want to believe is unique and began with a historical Jesus and Christianity. You can find all of these ideas in the Dead Sea Scrolls, like circumcised heart, preparing the way in the wilderness, even the idea of two messiahs, so like one high priest, one kingly messiah. So many other ideas. Son of God, there's a Son of God scroll.
Well, this is interesting. So when exactly would you place in terms of dates, so we could create the kind of picture in people's heads? When would the Dead Sea Scrolls, when were they discovered? When are they dated?
Don't they say like 170 BC,
Okay,
270 AD? That's the dating. I'm pretty sure.
It's around about the Maccabees
I've heard
time.
most of it.
It's around about the Maccabees time. Yeah.
During the Maccabees period. And by the way, the Maccabees period is when Israel as a unified nation begins. So, for example, before that, you have different cities. They have shared culture. They all worship Baal, Asherah, Yahweh, El, right? So there's a shared culture in this Levantine period area. But there's not like a unified kingdom until the Maccabees. They start to conquer all those outside lands.
Oh, dear.
It's interesting because the Dead Sea Scrolls shows that they're no longer focusing on the temple in Jerusalem. The religion is going towards the outside world at this point. But not to Greece yet.
They were anti-temple, like Christianity. They were anti-temple and anti-temple sacrifices.
It's a medium between Christianity and Judaism. You're seeing a more out there. Not forget the temple. Let's focus on these other Israel areas, right? You know, the Dead Sea, Qumran, that type of region. Circumcising the heart, not in the flesh. You start to see
New Covenant as well. They were talking about New Covenant.
And by the way, the people are going to probably be asking us, what about the prophets? And then we just real quick, just to highlight what I think about that. I do think those prophets probably do exist, and I think some of the layers in the prophetic text probably do go back to before the Hellenistic period. It's just that when the finished product that we have has been interpolated and changed so much, the final product that we have of these prophets is somewhere in the 200s, 100s BC. Dead Sea Scrolls is probably where you get a finished product of these prophets of Jeremiah, Zechariah, Ezekiel, etc. And that's why you see like this different outlook. It sort of contradicts what we get in the Torah, because there's a different time period, different political situation going on. There's a need for, like Adam points out, a new covenant, which was what you get. And people think that new covenant from Zechariah is a later interpolation from that text, probably in the same period that we're talking about.
And so why
texts, they call them rolling texts, which means there probably was an old book of Jeremiah that existed all the way back to like 500 BC. Probably was it, but this text probably had no knowledge of Moses, no knowledge of Abraham, no knowledge. It probably was just some random oracle given by Yahweh to the Jerusalem people. And then over time, Jeremiah starts adding more layers to it. adding more layers to it until you get to the Maccabee period, and then you get a finished product of Jeremiah.
There's the documentary hypothesis, and you can see there's like two different stories that they both kind of merged and include. That's why you get different Noah's Ark stories. And there's supposedly like two different Isaiahs as well, right? So,
and by the way, real quick, and that's why you don't get a lot of talk about Moses and Abraham in the prophets. They barely mention, if you notice this, when you go back and read Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Isaiah and whatever, pick one, Zechariah, notice how little they talk about Moses and Abraham. Think about that. And the prophets are the oldest layer. So there's not, why aren't they all, it should be all about Moses and Abraham, because that's their origin story. The very few times they do mention Moses and Abraham, I think it's only 2 or 3 times in the prophets, those parts seem to be added on at some point during the periods that we're talking about.
Okay, so we have then this period, the Maccabees, 1070 BC. The Dead Sea Scrolls are here as well. And we're sort of seeing the beginning then of the symbolism. So it's like these guys, these meme magician type characters, and obviously I don't mean this with the meme mystics, we'll call them. They're like comic book characters, Hollywood guys, and they're studying this sort of new religion, I guess they've generated, and they're digging into it, and they're pulling out all these symbols, and this sets the stage for the arrival of Christ, essentially, or the arrival of the Christ, or the concept of the Moshiach. And Adam, for example, you bring up the Son of Man. You say this is getting mentioned in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So what exactly would that symbol represent? Because that's a big deal. Christ in the Gospels is saying, I am the Son of Man, I'm the fulfillment, and I'm the Son of God, this type of thing. So why is this such a big deal, and what do you see going on there?
The Son of Man character you find in Daniel, you find also throughout Enoch.
Could you maybe explain people, so Daniel, like, because I know who Daniel is, but like...
Daniel 7, right.
Yeah, like so Daniel the prophet.
By the way, Daniel is one of the 2 times that Moses is mentioned, and it's one of the later Hellenistic era texts. So, and by the way, the other 3, it's only mentioned 5 times. I looked it up. The other 3 times are during Persian era books, Ezra and Nehemiah.
Okay, so this is
mind blowing. Before the Persian period, the prophets never mentioned Moses.
Oh my God.
Never mentioned in Zechariah, never mentioned in Ezekiel, never mentioned in Isaiah, never mentioned in Jeremiah. No Moses. It's not until Daniel, who mentions him twice, and Ezra and Nehemiah, the last 2 prophets in the Bible, that they start talking about Moses. Isn't that odd?
So Daniel, the thesis here would be, through textual analysis, the prophet Daniel was written in the Hellenic times, and he's not from Babylon. Oh my God.
Yeah, it's a forgery.
By the way, I can tell you why we know this.
Why, Adam, why is it a forgery?
And they wrote it to like fix a failed prophecy from Jeremiah. Richard Carrier has a really good video about the Daniel as a forgery on Myth Vision.
Because Zechariah is one of the last. It's one of the Persian period books. It's one, like I said, it's one of the last prophetic texts that we get where you get actual Messiah prophecies. They don't come true. So Daniel has to fix the 70 weeks thing and makes it about 70 years or whatever. Like he's changing all the numbers around. Also, Daniel.
No way.
Daniel is answering. Daniel asks questions. Okay, Maccabees is fulfilling Daniel. They look like they're being. It's like one of them is a prequel, the other one's a sequel. That's one clue, because Maccabees is obviously written in the Maccabee period. It's Maccabees. It's impossible for it to be written before that, right? Because it's talking about things that happen in the 150s. Maccabees is fulfilling things that happens in Daniel. For example, the abomination, the desolation. In Maccabees, Antiochus brings in the idol of Dionysius into the temple. That's alluded to in Daniel. So a Christian might say, well, it's a prophecy. Well, here's the problem with that. Daniel, the author of Daniel, is using idioms that only exist in Hellenistic period times, like calling Greece Yavana. That means Ionia. That's a colony of Greece that existed probably after 400 BC.
No way.
So that's the one big slam dunk. It's also written in the dialect of Aramaic that was prominent in that period. And then it has a last chapter 12 or 13, I think it is, written in the original is written in Greek. The original is written in Greek, and we know this because in the Greek it's using like a prose. It's almost like not rhymes, but like it flows. There's like idioms. They're using certain words that flow together. And you read it in Greek, it makes sense. When you read it in Hebrew, it's all chopped up and
Oh
makes
no.
sense. And so even Christian scholars like Julius Africanus, writing later on, even he's going, we have a problem with Daniel. The last chapter, the Bell and the Dragon stuff, that seems to be written in Greek. The Greek version makes a lot more sense, whereas the Hebrew version doesn't really make any sense. So you have all this evidence showing that Daniel is a Hellenistic text written to prophecy what happens in Maccabees.
It's
So
actually so
Maccabees is
crazy.
fulfilling. And by the way, it talks about a Messiah that will fall. Onias is an anointed priest who is killed by the Seleucids. So it's like there, and this is what any rabbi would say, that Onias is the anointed that falls. But then they reinterpret that for Jesus later on too.
Okay.
But it's screaming. It's written in 160s. It's screaming at you. All the evidence is pointing to that.
Okay, so we're seeing then that it's written in this Greek time, as Adam's pointing out. Quite a lot of the symbolism that justifies the concept of the Messiah comes from Daniel. So like maybe Adam, you could tell me more about this, but
yeah.
Go on.
Am I mute? No. Yeah, there's a really good book, The Jewish Gospels by Daniel Boyarin. He's a Talmudic scholar, and he talks about how Christianity was basically created from a Midrashic connection of the
Adam,
Son of Man.
Sorry to pull you up, Adam.
Yes.
So you said Midrashic several times now. What does Midrashic mean?
It's defined in the books. Midrash is basically connecting different scriptures that are unrelated or maybe have a similar theme to interpreting them together, like they're talking about the same person.
So it's a Jewish mode of interpretation that not only engages the words of the text behind the text, but beyond the text, and focuses on each letter. So it's like a way of reading. It's like critical theory, I guess, in some sense.
It's a way of interpreting the text. Yeah.
Okay. And this is
connecting different things together.
So this would be like the Jewish kind of like canonical scholarship on how to interpret text or something like this.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Okay. Fair enough.
Yeah. So they're searching for mysteries. They're connecting the suffering Messiah of Isaiah 52 and 53 to the Son of Man in Daniel 7, who comes in the clouds of heaven, who has dominion over all the earth, and who is, it says later in chapter 9 that he's cut off. It says the anointed one, the Moshiach, is cut off. So that's where they get the dying from. And you can see all over the Gospels, it mentions the Son of Man like 40 times. It's like, I think it's 12 times in Mark alone. And they say that the idea of the suffering and the 3 days and the resurrection, that this comes from, it's the blending of the Son of Man in Daniel and the suffering Messiah in Isaiah 53. And then they also find similar things in Zechariah 3, 6, 9, and 12. And they compile the whole thing, and you get the whole core of the Jesus story. Like Neil was talking about how Mark doesn't include the birth narrative, the nativity narrative. Neither does any of Paul's letters. He never mentions the virgin birth, the star, any of that stuff. It's not in the book of Hebrews either, as well. So this didn't come until the Gospel of Matthew, which is based on Mark. It's copying and expanding Mark, and it's probably written 50, 60 years after Jesus supposedly died. And that's the first time we got in the whole story in Gospel Fictions by Randall Helms. He goes through the whole birth narrative. Galilee of the nations, he's from Galilee. No, that actually is a prophecy from Isaiah. He's the Nazarene. No, that actually means the branch, Nazarite. He comes out of Egypt. That's another prophecy. He's born in Bethlehem. That's to fulfill another prophecy. The star, that's Numbers 24:17. The star of Jacob will rise. The kings coming with their gifts, also prophecy. The swaddle, the manger, all other prophecies that they use to create this completely fictional birth narrative.
Oh, by the way, I want to add to that too. Even though I do think there was a guy that they're applying himself.
You agree the whole birth narrative in nativity is based on scripture. Yeah.
And I'll even go farther than you in this. If you were to do a project where you took the Gospels, use the 3 synoptic Gospels, John's a little more later, whatever. If you just take Matthew and Mark or something, whatever, it doesn't matter. Take the Gospels and you take all the stuff that's in the Gospels that's being drawn from Old Testament prophets, and you delete those, okay? Then you take all the stuff that's being drawn from surrounding mythologies and motifs, and that's being applied to Jesus, and you know it didn't historically happen, but it's like a narrative thing. Delete those two, and then you're left with
Nothing.
barely anything. Maybe a few different sayings that he might have said that people are reliant. That can't even be proven either. But what I'm basically
from the
getting
Gnostic Gospel of Thomas.
yeah, and it's funny because those sayings align with Thomas. Those sayings that are in Thomas is what you'd be left with. You'd be left with a couple parables about the kingdom of Israel or the kingdom of heaven. That's it. So whatever, that's what I think. That's why I think there probably was a guy. I think there was a guy talking about a spiritual kingdom. Anyways, but the point I'm getting at is you're left with a skeleton, bare bones of some sayings of a guy walking around with disciples. That's it.
Adam, you're muted.
To give you a better definition of midrash, this is quoted in my book from Daniel Boyarin in the Jewish Gospels. He says, quote, that the Messiah would suffer and be humiliated was something Jews learned from close reading of the biblical texts, a close reading in precisely the style of classically rabbinic interpretation that has become known as midrash. And it is the concordance of verses and passages from different places in Scripture to derive new narratives, images, and theological ideas.
And so this is a habit of the Jewish people that stretches
That's what they were doing
into prehistory.
You see it in the Melchizedek scroll and the Dead Sea Scrolls. They're connecting Daniel and Isaiah talking about a messianic divine figure. The Son of Man sits on the throne. Also, he's like a semi-divine redeemer figure. And you can find it all throughout Enoch, telling exactly what he's meant to do. It's in many other places as well. And this is all pre-Christian.
Also, about the prophets backdating itself, this is not a new thing that the Israelites are doing.
Well, maybe
common practice. The Sibylline oracles, for example, that the Romans are using, are backdating themselves and saying these are old prophets from the Sibyl from 1,000 years ago, prophesying Caesar.
Okay,
and it's like no. They knew this is after Caesar.
Yeah.
But this is a common practice that governments and cults were doing. Backdating themselves and saying this was a prophecy the whole time.
Okay,
that's what this is not just Israelites doing this.
So it's like Alexander the Great going and getting the prophecy off the priest in Egypt, only there was a hole in the wall that listened to his prayer, and then it made him look mystical. So there's obviously like this very dirty incentive about prehistory when we've got these types of things. I guess the one thing I would say, because this is something that will pop into people's heads, is you lads are basically setting forth the thesis. Now I think it's quite a persuasive thesis, but you're setting forth the thesis that, like, listen, this Jesus figure matches all the prophecies. And your argument would be that, well, yes, because all these guys doing midrash, essentially like how the Talmud works, you have all these Jewish magician priests, comic book writers, there's meme mystics, and they're scribbling and they're going over, like you see in actually modern Jewish culture. You go into like modern Talmud class, or you look at like Jews that go to school and stuff and they study Torah. You speak to them and you ask them like, what are their lives like? And they do the exact same thing now.
Modern day religious people still are interpreting the scriptures for their current circumstances and their time, and like Bible code, connecting things together and then saying this is like what's about to happen. I discovered God's divine secret, the mystery hidden in the scriptures.
Yeah, like actually very true. So you go and you look on the internet right now and people will be having discussions. Is Donald Trump the Antichrist? And
or there's prophets all over the internet that go, I had this dream and Jesus told me this, and it connects to these two scriptures here. It's like the same thing that they were doing back then.
Yes. Okay, and so like that's important to understand for people to get a context, because this can feel very foreign. It's like, oh, it's like all in the ancient past. No, people do it all the time nowadays. Go on the internet and there'll be people who are, as I said, Donald Trump is the Antichrist, or as Adam said, they had a dream. It's contributing towards this. So we actually do use this is kind of contextual knowledge. Now, the argument that I'm definitely going to see people say is like, yes, does this not kind of prove the thesis that Jesus fulfills all the prophecies? Like, is there like, we're turning around and we're saying that like, oh, Jesus fulfilled all the prophecies, therefore he's not real, which is almost like the inversion of what most people will say. Well, it's like, of course this makes sense, because Jesus is in all the prophecies because he was real, because he did fulfill the prophecies. And
ready for this?
Go on, Neil. And then my question, I'd love to throw it at you. Then
yeah, I gotta add this to what Adam just said. So this is from Josephus' Jewish War, book 2, chapter 8. Chapter 8 is in like the 150s passages. He says, the doctrine of the Essenes is this: bodies are corruptible, and that matter they are made is not permanent. that souls are immortal and continue forever. So that's a Middle Platonist idea that's found in the Essenes, that's later found in Christianity, that Jesus' prophecy, Jesus is preaching heavily about the kingdom of heaven is spiritual, not physical, that bodies are corruptible, that souls are eternal. Middle Platonists, first of all, Essenes, second of all, and then Christian. But let me skip ahead again.
Logos idea comes from that too.
Yeah. There's a book right here I call The Middle Platonist. And it goes through all the Trinity, the Logos, and the immortality of the soul is all found in the Middle Platonist from 80 BC to 220 AD. Anyways, this is the big kicker that Adam just said. He also says, these are the divine doctrines of the Essenes about the soul, which lay unavoidable bait for such have once a taste of their philosophy. There are also among them who undertake to foretell things to come by reading the holy books and using several sorts of purifications, being perpetually conservant in the discourses of the prophets, and it is but seldom that they miss in their prediction. He's saying that they use the Torah, the holy books, to make prophecies about the current day. That's Midrash. He's explaining Midrash before the word Midrash existed.
Okay.
That's what he's doing right here.
So they're trying to use this to sort of say
memes.
These memes, yes, meme magic. Oh yeah.
So it is.
So I guess the question, as I was posing there just a second ago, was that like most Christians are a lot of Christians will turn around and say, well, you guys are backwards rationalizing and saying that Jesus doesn't exist because all these prophecies were made up. They're going to say the exact opposite. It's like, this is literally confirmation of the divinity of Christ. And what exactly would you say in response to that?
The extra biblical evidence for Jesus is not there at all. The Gospels are written decades after he supposedly died. The earliest layers of the Bible, you have a celestial Jesus and not a earthly preacher that was seen by people. Even Paul's description of the appearances of Jesus, this is post-resurrection appearances. He never talks about a preacher on earth doing miracles, teaching in parables, any of the biographical details we find from the canonical Gospels and the Synoptics. And I would also say, what is more likely, just like, let's be honest here, that a historical figure existed and just was checking the box of hundreds of prophecies. A lot of times they're pulling these things completely out of context. These prophecies aren't even messianic prophecies. Sometimes they're basing these prophecies in the New Testament on the Greek Septuagint, so showing that it's not even happening in Aramaic speaking with a historical figure. Also, you could see there's mistranslations that Christianity is built on, like, is it Isaiah 7:14, I believe, the virgin birth? It didn't even say a virgin in the Hebrew.
Only
it
in
just
the Greek.
says young
only
maiden.
the Septuagint becomes a virgin.
No.
Right.
Oh,
so in the original Hebrew, it's the maiden gives birth, and then in the Greek Septuagint, it's the virgin gives birth, and they use that for Christianity. But it's and then there's more. There's Psalms 20. Where there's in the Hebrew version, it's dogs surround me. Somehow the dogs surround me gets mistranslated into they pierce my hands and feet.
Right.
And then the pierce my hands and feet becomes the cross symbol. So they're using the translation of an original text that's a mistranslation to then use that as prophecy. It's showing that, like, these are human errors happening. We can see it happening in real time. It's funny.
And we can see the same thing happening in the Dead Sea Scrolls before Christianity. We can still see it after, too, with all the Apocrypha going on. They're doing the same thing, using scripture to fabricate stories. And I think people should look up Hebrews 10, 5-10. It says, when Christ came into the world, he said, but then they just put a direct quote from Psalms into the mouth of Jesus, where it says, here I am, it is written about me in the scroll. So they were reading all of these ancient prophecies, ignoring the original context, and using them as a puzzle where they can esoterically, mystically understand the hidden secrets of God by connecting these different things. And that's how you get all of these myths based on that.
Okay, and so it does sort of form as like almost like a psychological doctrine. Literally, like, this is very strong wording, but almost like a psychological warfare. You're trying to convert people to this new way of seeing the world, and you have someone like Paul, almost like an agent, going into Rome with this Gnostic religion where he's trying to say it to these communities and say, hey guys, and it's not a flesh type character. It's not really historical yet at this point. Paul is walking around and saying, lads, come in, we've got this sort of like meme religion, so it's like a meme cult, you know, and this idea about salvation from suffering and setting up a church. I'm really trying to just imagine this inside of my head. So Paul's like this Jewish guy. He's going around. He's speaking to all these little communities in the Roman Empire. He's saying to them, hey, this is a solution to the problem of pain and suffering and all the problems in the world. You look at Rome and you can tell that Rome's this big monstrosity. It's this big outside empire. It came and he conquered all of you. That's clearly like, you know, that's clearly the demiurge's work. So the demiurge is the evil god that rules over this planet. And in fact, I'm bringing you this actually like special sort of mystical power story where if you get in our little cult, you actually are able to resist that while not doing anything too suspicious, like making yourself a political enemy or something like this. And so it becomes like this very, very subtle and intelligent, like socialist movement, nearly in some sense.
What I think makes it so appealing to a lot of Greeks is that it's very clear on its stance about Jews, that they're not chosen really anymore, that they lost the covenant, and the covenant's for anybody. So the first Q saying that we have that shows up in Thomas and it shows up in Matthew and Mark, it's one of the sayings is, you offspring of vipers, who warned you to flee from the fury to come? Bear fruit worthy of change. Don't start to say to yourselves, we have Abraham as our ancestor, because I tell you that God is able to raise up children from Abraham from these stones. He's basically saying, who cares who your father is? But believing in me makes you an Israelite.
Oh, wow.
So that becomes an appealing thing. Well, you don't have to be Jewish anymore. It's for everyone now. And it's like not only that, the Jews are cast aside as the people who lost the covenant. They become the enemy, sort of, even though it's sort of coming. It's basically saying that's the old ways. Here's the new way. And this is the one that's going to be successful in the Roman Empire.
So is this like, this is obviously conspiracy brain. So reel me in if I'm thinking it too crazy. So they sort of craft this like Platonic, you know, a load of Platonic priests, the philosopher kings of the Maccabee era. They create this Judean religion. And it's up and running now at this point. And then do they, like a couple of these guys, get together and sort of say to themselves, right, we need a solution for the problem of Rome. We need a couple of Hollywood directors and say to ourselves, right, how do we solve the problem of Rome? We need to get these Roman guys to stop believing in Rome, and we need to get them on side with us, and we need to get them to change their minds and stop being these evil Roman imperial beasts. You know, Nietzsche's idea, like the master morality needs to be bent and feel guilty towards the slaves.
Yeah, the old order needs to go. The new order needs to
so the new order needs to come. So
it's anti Sadducee, it's anti Pharisee. But notice how it never says anything about the Essenes. The Essenes are never thrown in that mix.
Oh my days!
So the Essenes are like this new Jewish sect. They're like the liberal Jews, and they're against the conservative Jews. They're not Zion. You know what I'm saying? They're like they're more worldly. They're more like they're trying to really put themselves out there and sort of go into the world and forget about the temple. It's a different sect that's completely antithetical to this old order. By the way, the Sadducees and Pharisees had a good deal with the Romans. They had set up a deal where it's like, all right, every 7 years we get to collect our taxes, but then during the next 6 years we're going to pay the taxes to Rome, and you guys are going to give us military compensation and help us out against the Parthians if we need it. Boom! They had a great deal going on. The Essenes were like, that order needs to go. We need a new order. Okay. That order, that's the archons of this world. Those are the evil archons of this world. So you can see how they're coming up with a new, more worldly approach to the text,
and they specifically aim to universalize it then. So they sort of say, this is for Rome, this is for, because I guess what I'm leaning at here is that the typical idea you might get from a Nietzschean is that you know, Christianity was a psyop by the Jews, and they created this weapon that they were going to try take down the Roman Empire with, or something like this. And there's a couple.
You can almost say that's correct in the sense that if you're looking at the Essenes as the Jews.
But then that makes a mistake.
It's one aspect, it's one sect of the Jews that I think this is mostly coming out of.
Okay, so
whereas the Pharisaic and Sadducees, they're a different. They have a different order going on. That's not exactly what Christians are trying to. Later Christians are
Okay.
aligned.
But that would be a mistake then to say that the Judeans like ran this as a plan then or something. It actually seems much more like I guess you could see now you'd have like Bernie Sanders probably hates Ben Shapiro. And it's
Yeah,
like, it's
like that.
that type of
There
like
you go.
clashing between the two of them. And then you might
Yeah.
say like Bernie Sanders, the liberal, is subverting Western culture with his Marxism, whereas Ben Shapiro is standing up for conservative values. And so it's much more complicated maybe than you could simple statements like I just made.
Right.
Right. It's more of like a messianic conspiracy. So the idea of like them interpreting the prophecies of the Messiah and the end times and the apocalypse, that's kind of what drives the whole thing. Like Paul may have been a sincere believer that learned about this, Christian sect that had a belief in a heavenly Messiah that did this sacrifice in heaven, like in Ascension of Isaiah, and wanted to, like, he calls himself like chosen in the womb, and he read the scriptures and decided that he was the apostle to the Gentiles. And he's an agent of fulfilling the messianic conspiracy of fulfilling the prophecies to bring the Gentiles in to worship the God of Israel and abandon their idols. So on that's the sense where I see the root of the conspiracy. It's the messianic Torah Yahweh endgame of like, conquering the world, theologically subjugating the world.
Yeah, well, like so that's a really interesting idea to dig down into then. So the kind of spirit of Israel, and I mean this by like Yahweh and Israel, is that idea of like, all right, the world has fallen, and we need to redeem the world in the name of the kingdom of God and set up a new order. And we want to have it where, like Israel, Jerusalem is the center, and everybody follows Noahide, and then the chosen people sort of interface with Yahweh, and like that philosopher kings of the whole world, they dole out the laws to all the people.
The law will come forth from Zion, as it says.
By the way, I think a better term to call them is Yahwists rather than Jews, because at this point in time, Yahwism is starting to spread into the Greek world already. Before we even get Christianity or Paul or the Gospels, you have these little church, they call ecclesias, which is what we translate as churches, all over the Greek world. And it starts at the time of when the Romans are on the rise. The Roman Republic faces off with the Macedonians. The Roman Republic wins a giant war over naval supremacy. After beating the Carthaginians, they go east and they defeat Antiochus III, not the fourth. This is before the Maccabees, right before the Maccabees. Antiochus III, who's called Antiochus the Great, loses this major battle to the Roman Republic over Macedonia, basically, and the Athenian order ends up going, okay, we're no longer supporting Seleucus, now we're supporting Rome. Rome becomes the dominant force of the Mediterranean, and as a result of that, Antiochus, who's the Seleucid king, has to give up all of his naval ships to Rome. He no longer has any control over any trade in the Mediterranean. And not only that, Rome makes him give up, I think that says like 2 million Jewish slaves to go into Greece and populate these new cities that Rome just conquered in Asia Minor and Greece. As a result of that, you get Jewish Hellenism mixing in Greece and Asia Minor. So all these new slave class of Jews are now inhabiting these urban areas of Pergamum, of Corinth, of Ephesus, of Philippi. And this is where you start getting this idea of Yahwism spreading and sort of mixing with Hellenism and sort of copying the mystery religions in their own way. So by the time Paul comes along, there already is a whole network of churches who don't even know who Jesus is, but they're already doing something similar to Christianity.
Wow, that is.
So it's not like Jesus conquers the whole Greek world. The Greek world is already being influenced by Judaism.
Wow.
Or I'll call it Yahwism, because it's a lot of Gnostic shit going on too.
Okay, so Paul is essentially this guy who organizes this into a Jewish mystic Gnostic religion, from what I understand. So he is this idea. Oh, okay.
No, I think he got it from James and Cephas, Peter and John.
Okay, so
and maybe a Essene group of 12, like he says it himself. Yeah. Like he came to James, Peter, and the 12, and then last of him also. And then he goes, he saw the Lord, so that implies that that's also how they were seeing the Lord, from their mystical experiences and from the scriptures.
And the way I see it is that these churches that are already there, that Paul's writing to, that is an already existing network of churches who are Greek-speaking followers of Yahweh. They probably have Septuagint copies laying around in their synagogues. and Paul is this Pharisee, this authoritarian. He's got authority, right? He's a Pharisee, and he's coming to these churches and telling them, "Oh, there was a Messiah. He came, and he told us to do this now." And they're going to be like, "Oh, well, that's the Holy Land. We got to follow that."
Yeah.
So there's an authority happening from Paul going into these Greek cities where these Jews are living, telling them we have a new Messiah and a new covenant. Here's the new order now, and they're just going to follow it. It's like, why not? It's the Holy Land.
So I have a question then, because this is like quite shocking, because it's literally at this stage it's only a meme. Now, like the thesis I assume that's getting presented right now is that Christ didn't exist. Although Neil, you're saying that like he was literally a historical figure, but he wasn't.
I think Paul was probably talking about, in my opinion, I think Paul was telling them that this guy did come. Whether he came in the flesh, whether he came as a human being or if he came sent from the heavens, that's another question. But I do think even the Docetist idea that Christ lived on this planet, he did these things, he performed these miracles, and then went to the cross as a ghost figure. The Docetist idea that Christ wasn't really a flesh, but he was a divine figure that actually was existing. People saw him, his image. Whether that's the idea or they talked about an actual person who died, and that's a whole other question. But I do think that Paul was telling them that these events actually did happen.
What events? Because all he really talked about was the crucifixion, the burial, and resurrection. That's all he knew.
Him being handed over on the night he was handed over. He talks about in what is it, Corinthians? On the night.
He says that's from Revelation, though. That's when he talks about the Lord's Supper. The earliest version of the Last Supper that we have is from Paul, and he wasn't there. He didn't learn about it from anybody that was attendance. He says explicitly he got it. He received it from Revelation.
And when you say received it from Revelation, do you mean he saw it in a vision?
That's what
vision or reading it from the scriptures, because their way of learning about what Jesus did and said was just from reading the scriptures. And they'd say, and being inspired by the Holy Spirit.
And so
reading the scriptures.
Inspired by the Holy Spirit is basically like you're reading it and then your imagination switches on and you see these ideas in there and you're like, wow, oh my God. So he's literally fantasizing.
I agree with you.
Using that as an authority.
I agree with you on this part that he got this from a divine revelation. But I think the revelation was about a historical event that actually happened. Paul thinks this in his head. Paul thinks that he was given a vision about Jesus giving bread and doing a Eucharist on the night he was handed over, as for Corinthians 11 says.
But he doesn't say where this is taking place at. He doesn't say it's in Jerusalem. He doesn't say that it's a Passover Seder the night before Passover.
Right. He doesn't say that.
He doesn't say who is actually there. And the way he's addressing it is not as if Jesus was talking to a room of people, but if he's talking to all Christians today.
No, and like I said, I wouldn't be surprised if you were correct on this, but I just think Paul would be more specific if that was the case. I think he's making it seem like this actually happened.
And isn't this Paul created an anathema where Jews aren't going to consume the blood of their Messiah, because you're not allowed to consume blood in Judaism. But there are mystery religions that had blood and wine, or even a Melchizedek tradition of, blood and wine. Wine and bread is what I meant.
That's where I think these Greek gospel authors
isn't it based on Dionysius also, the Last Supper, the bread and the wine? I
think it's heavily influenced by the Eucharist that we find in the Eleusinian mysteries, which is the Demeter represents the grain and the bread. Dionysius represents the blood and the wine and the
okay, I have two big questions here. So maybe one is just kind of setting the frame. First of all, the thing that you guys are talking about right now is just kind of a very important question, but a question of like, all right, Adam, you're basically suggesting that historical Jesus was not real at all. And what happened is that these guys were doing meme magic. They were hanging out in their like intellectual circles and thinking like the concept of the Messiah is what we need in order to transform the world. We need to have a world revolution. We don't like our position in the world. And this dream of this messianic figure is what we want. And if we worship this, we achieve a Gnostic victory over the world. And so it's entirely abstract, and it actually slowly materializes into a historical fake story about a dude who actually exists. And what just one second. And what Neil, you're basically suggesting, perhaps as a counter argument, and obviously people can explore this themselves. You're saying, hey, there was a historical figure, and he may have even been quite a like interesting prophet, and he might have had some interesting sayings, because this is what we get from like the Gnostic Bibles. He may have been like, you know, a wise man like Gandhi or something like this, but he wasn't like the son of God or anything like this. All of that mythos was projected upon him, and you see that it gradually, as time goes forward, the projections get heavier and heavier until they fully consolidate as like a full myth. So
this is where we disagree on is 1 Corinthians 11, and I'm saying that Paul is getting a vision about Christ that happened, that he thinks happened when Jesus got put to the cross. I think reading 1 Corinthians 11 just without any just fresh, what you're getting from Paul is he thinks that this actually happened, that Jesus actually said these words to his disciples, that he took bread and he ate it, said, "This is my body, do this in remembrance of me," as if he's going somewhere else. Why would that, if this, like, I just don't understand why this would make sense if Paul didn't actually think this actually happened. Like, where's he going?
He thought it happened, but he said he received it from revelation. So I mean,
but I'm saying if he's telling his disciples, "Do this in remembrance of me," where is he going?
Well, he's talking to Christians today, giving them their ritual.
And they don't remembrance of me. It's like, you remember me from something. That means
Well, you can remember a mythological character too.
Right, but that would make more sense if the Gospels came before Paul's letters. Then I would be on board with you. Paul's letters are just a little too vague for me to think that he's talking about a mythological character at this point. He's just writing letters to people about a god. So that's why I think this is where we disagree on. I know that.
Look, let me come in. Neil, let me come in. So what I'd like to say to people is that, like, as you can see, these two gentlemen, they're not necessarily ideologues. You know, they're not coming out and being like, "Well, this is the thesis here." They actually try to look at the evidence, and they're trying to ponder themselves how to figure this stuff out. And you can actually see this, and obviously look it up yourself and dig it in. And like, is Neil's take correct? Is Adam's take correct? These are all things that you can go and try to find the source material. I'm trying to get these gentlemen to show you how they assess reality and truth, because they're following the scholarship, and these are all the questions: textual analysis, questions like why we even have to kind of make some assumptions psychologically, and it leads us to like very interesting and precise theses. I also find it so fascinating how close this is to Nietzsche's ideas, which he was getting off people like French writers like Renan about Christ as like this sort of like mystic figure. Now I have another question related to everything you're just saying there as well, which is something I want to hear, because a huge amount of this is related to the imagination and the mind. You know, what I imagine, what's going on in the mind, fantasy. I'm seeing God inside of my mind. So one side of this would be obviously, there's this like prestigious power of the imagination. And again, Adam, this goes back to what we were saying earlier, that it's very weird that we Europeans suddenly turn around and say our natural intuitive imaginations that would have generated the pagan gods, for example, we all of a sudden depedestalize that and call that as like satanic and evil and wrong, and then privilege the imaginations of St. Paul and these Jews from the Levant and say that these guys decide our fantasies and our dreams for the future. That's a very weird thing, first of all. So maybe that would be one question. And then the second one would be, how much would like psychedelics and Dionysus be related to stuff like this? You take mushrooms, you take psychedelics, you take some type of ergot, and it creates this sort of visionary experience. And Jesus is related into this. Like, I often wonder, if you went back to this 3rd century Greece, would you have come across like, you know, Greek kids going down to a Dionysius mystery, and then they experience the Christ, and this is kind of melding with Jesus and all this. So maybe that'd be a question for Neil. But I guess the first one would be me.
Can you let Neil take the hallucinogenic one? I'm going to run and pee real quick.
Okay, good stuff.
While he gets going on that.
Let's hit me, Neil.
I've discussed this at length in some of my videos regarding Dionysus, or I have a video specifically on Jesus and Dionysus, comparing the two. And people make this mistake all the time where they try to compare Jesus and Dionysus as the same thing. Jesus is secretly a different version of Dionysus. That's just not right. My takeaway from this is that the Dionysian is so widespread in culture at this time period. It's influencing the Attis cults, it's influencing Roman culture, it's influencing different gods are taking on characteristics of Dionysus. The Osiris mysteries in Egypt, Serapis is another Dionysian religion, according to Plutarch, Tacitus, and other ones. There's the Ion cult in Syria, the cult of Ion, which is, according to the Suda, is a combination of Osiris, Dionysus, and Adonis. You also have in the Phrygian mysteries, you have the Dionysian present with Cybele and Attis. They're weaving those two cultures together. Dionysus is everywhere. He's influencing everything. That's because the Dionysian is like the way the culture is being done. And what I mean by that is like Dionysian as like being freed through the use of ritual. So in Eleusinian mysteries, they're being initiated. It's a twofold initiation. A baptism, literally. They literally called it baptizo, to dip in water.
What?
That's your initial initiation. You wash off you're now washed off. You enter the temple, and then the second fold initiation is to eat bread and take a sip of a drink called kukion, which is either a beer or a wine mixed with some sort of psychedelic potion. That's a question we haven't figured out yet, but we know it's there. It's all in the sources. And you would drink this, and you would become initiated, and you'd become saved, and you'd become a member of Elysium, which is the heavenly part of Hades.
Yeah.
Above Hades in the underworld. It's where Saturn rules you, and you're literally exit the realm of reincarnation and become one with the gods. It's salvation. And so what I'm saying about Christianity is I'm not saying that they're secretly doing the worship or writing Dionysus as Christ. I'm saying they're drawing from the mystery languages and motifs as a Christian way, in the Christian sense.
Yeah.
So they're using the same sort of what's the word? The same
symbology,
but also like the way it's done. There's a whole book written about this called Christ Associations by John Kloppenborg. He's also done a lot of work on the Q documents, but he says that when we look at the early Christian associations that call themselves ecclesias, same thing that the Dionysian groups call themselves, ecclesias. It means church, right? So the Dionysians call themselves churches too, by the way. And so the way they operated, the way they had certain, the way they gave out their jobs to people, the way they had certain high priests, the hierophant was like the bishop, the way the structure, that's the word. The structure of the Dionysian cults is identical to the structure of the early Christian ecclesias, and how it is ran in a democratic fashion, top to bottom. And they're borrowing some of the motifs, as the Eucharist. They're borrowing their initiation. They're borrowing the mystery language that Paul talks about, the mysterion of Christ crucified. All over the text is all mystery, mystery, mystery. The Orpheus was the high priest of Dionysus, who revealed mysteries about the future. Jesus is the high priest, the Melchizedek, basically in that sense, of Yahweh, revealing the mystery of the heavens. So they're using the same structure that we find in the Dionysian to reapply to Judaism, and so you get this mystery religion version of Judaism, which is Christianity. And so instead of the bull being sacrificed for the sins of mankind, it's the lamb being sacrificed for the sins of mankind. So they're not just copying or plagiarizing. That's the wrong word to use. They're reinterpreting, and they're actually doing a polemic against the Dionysian in a lot of ways. They're flipping it on its head. It's a reversal of the poles of morality.
Okay, so that makes sense. So like would that count then as evidence that like early Christians would be engaging in psychedelic practices of sorts? Because I think this is something that is very useful for people to try pull their minds back into this part of the world. I love to think about this almost like a film, you know? You can imagine yourself in ancient Greece, and it's like going to Burning Man or something like this. And you go into Burning Man, and it's this weird outside of civilization place, and everybody acts like kind of funky and all this, and you go into it, and there's all these rituals involved with it, and it's fun. And then in the middle of it, you take a very large dose of LSD. Now they would have maybe took mushrooms or something like this, and what happens as a consequence is that you have a mind destroying, mind melting experience. Like LSD causes like mass communication among the brain, and this causes all sorts of experience. You literally have trade openness opening up and stuff like this inside of people, and that is actually a very good foundation for a religious experience. Like that would objectively change people. And
there's actually evidence of this too. So first of all, I wanted to say real quick too that Dennis MacDonald wrote a book about the Dionysian gospel. John's gospel in particular is drawing from the Euripidean tragedy and applying it to Christ as the tragedy of being crucified, right? It's very Dionysian. It's written almost in like a play. It's almost written as like it sounds like a tragedy being performed in a theater. Anyways, that's one aspect of the Dionysian that I wasn't getting into. That's outside of the psychedelics. The structure of the tragedy itself. Forgot to mention that, but that's a big one. But you mentioned, is there evidence that early Christians were practicing psychedelics? The answer is yes. A lot of scholars don't even talk about this. Why? I don't know if they're studying. It seemed to only be looking at like 4th century Christian and later for some reason. They're all focused in that later 4th century early Christianity. Whereas if we look at the 2nd century Christianity, Hippolytus discusses a group called the Valentinians, and one of their bishops was named Marcus. They call him Marcus the Magus, and he was charged with taking hallucinogens and adding it to the Eucharist, and giving it to women so that these women would have visions of Christ, and he would turn the women into the Delphic Sibyl and say, "Whatever you say is prophecy.
Okay.
Tell us what visions are you getting?" And he was giving them psychedelics to do this. We also have the text about the Naesenes, who were led by a guy named the Nicene preacher. They started down in Egypt, and they spread all the way to Asia Minor. Huge early Christian sect that were practicing, doing the same rituals that you find in Eleusis, calling Christ the fulfillment of the Eleusinian mysteries. And then the Nicene preacher even tells his initiates to go and visit Phrygia and watch the Phrygian mysteries, which is the Attis mysteries, the Hilaria festival, which every year was celebrated on March 22nd. They would do a day of mourning, and they would bury a pine tree in the ground. 3 days later, on March 25th, was called the Day of Rejoicing, where they celebrated the resurrection of either, if it was in Egypt, it'd be Osiris. If it was in Rome, it'd be Attis. And the Phrygians, or the Nacenes, were encouraged to go and visit these rites that were instituted by Claudius in the 40s AD. So we're talking about an institution of dying and rising rituals that the Romans are doing, influencing early Christianity, and psychedelics are involved in those too. So that's why it's like really clear. The evidence is really clear that the earliest Christians were a lot more connected to the pagan world than we think.
Okay, so like there's so much in that. It's so fascinating, because Adam was bringing up this strange nature of Christianity and the sort of like chronology of it. It seems like it starts with much more language like spiritualism, and it's abstract, and Paul has visions, and then maybe later it becomes more tactile and it's about a man with the flesh. And so the argument there is that it's actually literally like an idea of the mind. Christ is an idea of the mind that consolidates into a real person. And I wonder how much then like would psychedelic culture fit into that as well, because that obviously turns meme magic up to 11 type thing, and it becomes very, very strange. So that's a fascinating concept. I guess the question I have for Adam right now is, all right, well, we've actually finally, after quite a bit of time, and if you don't have any more time, by the way, tell me. I know that we're kind of getting into it here a little bit, but this leads us now up to this point where we have this like sect operating very, very well, and it begins to penetrate into Rome. So how do you see that kind of era of history, and what do you think is important to know about this stuff? And what do you see about the kind of early tentacles of Christianity going into Rome, and how does it change culture, and how does it have the effect of bringing Romans over to this way of seeing the world?
Paul introduced Judaism for Gentiles, Messianic Judaism, to the Gentile world, mostly the Romans and the Greco-Roman world. And what did he tell them? He told them that their gods are all demons, basically. He said that they're demons, and if they want to have a share in the world to come, they need to worship the God of Israel and his Messiah. And once Constantine adopted this, within a few decades, the pagan pantheon was outlawed, and they would execute you if you promoted pagan religions. So, and then now it spread around the world. Basically the Roman Empire adopted the cause of the Torah and spread, largely by the sword and through coercion and conversion, spread the God of Israel and the Torah as the word of God around the world. And then later Islam also is viewed as a Noahide religion. They're worshiping the God of Abraham. They believe in Jesus as a messianic figure as well, that is going to return in the end times, like Christians believe. So it Judaized the world, basically. It conquered paganism and Judaized the world.
And so the specific way you see this is working is, okay, these guys like Paul and obviously the Christian sect, it goes into Rome. And it's like you say, Judaism for Gentiles. So this messianic sort of Gnostic way of understanding reality that is inherent within early Christianity has the effect of like washing people. So people who convert over to it and accept Christ into their hearts, they basically are forced to wash out of themselves all previous beliefs and gods. And
there's another important factor that's happening with Platonism. Platonism is rejecting the Homeric, Hesiodic worldview.
It is. Yeah, that's true. That's very true.
And so, like these Middle Platonist philosophers, I keep talking about the Middle Platonists.
Sorry, I just want to say this for the audience to make it clear as well, because like some of this stuff is a little bit dense. I'm speaking, let's get it out here properly. So Plato is actually quite famous. This is one of the things Nietzsche says about Plato is like he's almost like a class traitor because he was an aristocrat. And everybody, Nietzsche would say, like, why did he turn around and say stuff like, we should banish music? That was Socrates. We should get rid of the old gods because they're fake and create a sort of new religion in order to rule society. So it's almost like he's weirdly like a leftist, if you want to use modern terms. And he's saying, like, get rid of the old god and we'll create a new religion and we'll free ourselves from the superstition. And he was sort of saying that about the old Greek gods that you would understand as maybe even Zeus and stuff like this. And
he goes. If you read Republic, particularly Book 3, he completely goes off on Greek culture, paganism. He can't stand it. Heraclitus too. Heraclitus was like, idolatry is dumb. These people are talking to wooden idols like they're talking to a doorpost. He's making fun of the Dionysian mysteries and all that stuff. He's like saying that these people are doing orgies. They're idiots. They want this new, rational, more mature, philosophical, spiritual thing. And by the way, Plato, when he talks about his noble lie, he goes, how are you going to tell? What are you going to tell? How are you going to tell this noble lie? He says to Socrates Socrates, you go, some Phoenician myth. He says some Phoenician myth. And it's interesting because the Phoenicians are the Easterners. And it's like later on, the Ptolemies, I think, are drawing from Plato's idea and let's give them this exotic Eastern mythology that they're going to look at as some exotic Eastern, the way we look at Buddhists and Hindus are exotic Eastern shit.
Way.
That's the way the Greeks would look at Judaism.
No way.
I could pull up the passage if you want to hear it. It's literally talking about the noble lie. He goes, we'll tell him some Phoenician myth.
And go on, put it up.
And it's the same chapter of the Republic where he goes off on Homer, goes off on Hesiod, he goes off on Zeus as a bad example, he goes off on Achilles as being a bad example. He's basically destroying Western culture in one chapter and saying we need to replace it with a better, more mature, a mythology that says the good will go to a good place and the bad will go to a bad place. Instead of everyone going to Hades and being gloomy, the good will inherit the heavens and the bad will inherit Hades. That's fucking Christianity, dude. That's Judeo-Christianity being explained right 100 years before Judeo-Christianity even existed.
And Jesus is like a celestial figure as in Middle Platonism, where they had like the heavens and the world. So he's like the high priest that's in heaven. That's kind of how he's described in Hebrews and in Paul.
The Middle Platonists discuss a monad, which is unknowable, unnameable. This is why you see in Christianity, they don't even use the word Yahweh. They just call him God the Father. He's unknowable, unnameable. And God the Father doesn't really talk to he needs a mediator, which is the Son, which is a duad, a dyad, Holy Spirit and flesh. So when Middle Platonism talks about a monad making the world from a dyad using a logos, it's literally what you get in John. Literally what you get in John.
It is, yeah. It is. Yeah, it's crazy. Well, I guess there's like, because this is something, Neil, you've said before, which is an interesting thing to ponder, because maybe I'm kind of heavily leaning and I'm saying stuff like, oh, is it a Jewish conspiracy? Did they psyop the Romans and all this? But you were saying earlier, and this is something I've thought about too, because of all these allusions to Plato. And of the thing that we were saying about the Maccabees, where the Maccabees picked up like the premier philosophy of their day, which would have been Platonism, and used it to create a religion. And so is this not a roundabout way of basically saying that Judaism is actually just a form, a kind of a practical application of Platonism? Like Judaism is like a Hellenic Platonic religion.
You're right. That's the best way to describe it. It's the practical application of Plato.
Oh my God! So
for your own cult, using your own mythologies, your own history, your own, the kings of Israel and Moses and your own mythology, and then filtering it through Platonist philosophy to create it's exactly what I think is happening in the 3rd century BC.
And do you think it's something where it got out of hand? It was almost like a golem that the Greco-Roman world created. And
once you start memes, they roll out of control and everybody changes them and they evolve and there's different factions competing with the memes. Absolutely.
So it's sort of like maybe like Plato creates this concept of like, all right, this is how you create a republic. And this rolls down into Egypt. And then they morphs and then the Jews pick it up and then they create the Maccabean state, we'll say. And then that morphs, and then even the Jews themselves sometimes get screwed over by Christianity. And then all of a sudden now we have this like really refined, purified, messianic Judaism, which is talking about the total destruction of all other ways of seeing the world in favor of this one. And this sort of project and plan to create a philosopher king Platonic project in Rome, which is what they achieve. And this ends up going on to literally, in some sense, take over the world as a consequence. So this is sort of the narrative of the history we're getting.
You guys want to hear Platonic?
With the high priest on top, who's the philosopher king. That's the Pope.
Yeah,
you know what I mean. It's describing what you get in Western Catholicism. What ends up happening.
That's
Plato's vision is materialized throughout the centuries, and by the time you get to Constantine, it's realized. You know what I mean?
Adam, you're going to say something there?
Yeah, since we're talking Plato, when you read Hebrews, listen to this. It says, Hebrews 9:24, for Christ did not enter a sanctuary made by human hands that was only a copy of the true one. He entered heaven itself. So the copy of the temple, the sanctuary in heaven, like Plato's forms, like the perfect form. So Jesus represents, there's another one here too. Hebrews 8. We do have such a high priest who sat down at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven and who serves in the sanctuary, a true tabernacle set up by the Lord, not by a mere human being. And then later it says, if he were on earth. So you can see here in the earliest layers of the New Testament, Hebrews comes before the Gospels, and it has Jesus, no earthly figure. It's an anti-temple, anti-sanctuary, and Jesus is the new Platonic high priest and sacrifice that happened in the heavenly temple.
Okay, so it's like almost like at this point it's a philosophical psychological religion. And
it's like fan fiction. They're creating like a fan fiction of mysteries that they think they're reading from, and they don't have to be. Maybe they were taking psychedelics, but they don't need to. Reading these different scriptures all day, going, well, that kind of sounds like that, and that's the same word as used there, and then they read all these things, go to sleep, have a dream, and go, this is what was revealed to me by God.
Okay, yeah. And this kind of paints, all right, there's two pictures you can paint out of this, because could you turn around and just sort of say like, this is based, it's Platonism put into practice, and whatever way it came about, it's quite funny and hilarious, but it turned out to fulfill Platonism. And here we have a religion that is empowering. And if you're the Catholic bishops in Rome and you're the Pope, you've got this like perfect tool for power to rule the world. It's an amazing weapon or tool or system that you could use in order to rule the world. Is that not a good thing? Should Western man not embrace that? Should we not be saying to ourselves, all right, Christianity is actually ours. It's basically a pagan system that we have. Or
it's good if you want to fall for a lie created by people that want to like theologically control you,
and so
which I'm against.
And so I guess that's the counter thesis, is that like, would you say that rooted inside of this mimetically, so the symbols and the memes that are at the fundamental root of this is about coming from is like the Jewish soul, basically, which is like, all right, Edom, and you speak about this stuff an awful lot, like Edom and Amalek and all this fundamental perspective on the Europeans. This is Nietzsche, the perspective that you take on the world coming from the eyes of the Jews is that the Europeans, Rome, Edom, Amalek, they're all evil. They must be destroyed and taken down and eviscerated in order for a new world to be born, which is the world of Yahweh, the Yahwehist world, where it's a kind of reformation. So you would sort of say something like Platonic or not, fancy or not, maybe it's cool, decorated with Greek flag. It's still a problem.
The perfect idealistic one God that rules everything. It's a new theology. It's monism. That's what it is. That's what you get with Judaism. It's monism. One God in control.
Let me just throw that last question I was asking to Adam first because that is a good, interesting question to get into.
I found the passage, by the way, about the Phoenician tale. If you want me to tell it, but go ahead, finish that thought. You there,
Adam?
Are we waiting on me?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I missed.
Oh, yeah, my bad.
I got lost there.
So I was saying, on the one hand, we have Christianity is like, it's a practical creation of Platonism that's based on all this. Now, would the counter argument be, of course, that it's even though it might have the structure of Platonism, maybe you could call that base, maybe you don't like it, whatever. It's carrying within it this sort of symbols and mimetic energy of the Jewish people, and specifically these ones who might have resentment towards the Europeans. So, for example, they talk about like Edom and Amalek and Rome, and they wanted to see that destroyed and they want to see that pulled down. And so it's almost like a self-psyop subversion for the Europeans to embrace Christianity, because implicit within it is like a will, a desire to see Europe and Rome eviscerated. Do you see that as a good counter-argument?
Counter argument. That's why I'm opposed it, because it was intended on their Messiah to subjugate, like it says in Daniel, the Son of Man. He has dominion over the whole world, and if it's based on a lie, I don't want to have the whole world believing a lie that's meant. And also, I think it's it's subversive in a lot of ways. The morals that come from it, and just having the whole world falling for believing in a figure that didn't exist. They claim he was real. It's look at what it's led to. Look at the fruits of what it's led to. I think it's caused the Dark Ages. They erased, destroyed antiquity, the classical world. Think of all the knowledge that was lost. Think of all of the how society was impeded and hindered by this in so many ways. So no, I don't see the silver lining, like, oh well, there's a little core of Platonism, so I'm cool with it still. No, they overlaid, and twisted it. So I don't.
This is so perfect for what we're talking about guarding from the enemies of the world, and having like a protected class of chosen people. And this is right in Plato's book 3. Can I share my screen, or should I just read it?
I'm not sure. You can just read it, perhaps. Yeah, because I'm not sure if the screen.
So this is from book 3. All right, and people should look this up for themselves. If you go to Plato's Republic, book 3, and start right around verse 400, he starts talking about the form of the usefulness of deception. This is the noble lie, and he's saying, like, people who are well trained in culture should have the ability to use deception if it works. I'm just paraphrasing what I'm seeing here. So then he gets into this, and he goes, so Glaucon is like asking Socrates, like, what do you mean? Like, how would we even do this? And he says, what device could there be in the case of lies fabricated in a moment of need, which we were talking about just now? What should enable us, by telling one noble lie, to persuade the rulers themselves in particular, but if not the rest of the state? He says, what sort of lie? Nothing new, but a Phoenician tale. It's happened. He says, all over the place in the past, as the poets say, and persuaded people. It's happened. It hasn't happened in our time. And I don't know if it would happen, but to gain belief, it would need a lot of persuasion. Basically saying, like, we need an ancient story from people from a different Eastern land.
Oh my God.
And right before that, he even says, and I think of something like this. It means that it is truly most correct to refer to these men as guardians in the fullest sense, fighting against our enemies from without and looking after our friends within, so that the latter will not wish that the former will not be able to cause us harm. And it's like, this sounds like they're setting up the ideas that we end up getting adopted from in the Ptolemaic period by these Judeans.
Oh my God, yeah, that's crazy. Well, how do you see this playing out in history, and how does it lead us up to our day? Like, all right, we have this thesis now. people may disagree with it. I hope you see that we're trying to present the evidence that you can specifically attack, but this seems to be like the detail leveled arguments about this. We have an idea that Christianity and Christ himself actually began as like a mimetic mythos that consolidated into this idea of a real person, but the real person was a sort of different entity. We have even the creation of the Israelite religion about only, maybe 2,200 years ago, which is like very, very recent. But what happened in Rome is that it got into Rome, and through that got into all of Europe, and fundamentally changed Western history forever, and has been our religion since. And it's where we attach all our morality, and our church that we want to go back to when we want to become based and reject the modern world. This is what we have to do. Like, how does this set us up for the modern world now? Like, do you see it as like a fundamental obstacle that we're facing up against in the modern world? Do you see like people as being confused about life because of this? What do you see as the big issue?
Real quick on that, on being based and going back to the old ways. Read Nietzsche's On the Philosophy of the Tragic Age of the Greeks. He's talking about going back to even before Christianity, going back to the pre-Socratics. That's being based. That's what I want to see.
Well, just on that point, so you're bringing up earlier about how Plato countersignaled. Plato and Socrates are saying that like Homer is such a grug, Homer is such a mad lad, and of course isn't this what Nietzsche is saying? Is that Plato and Socrates were cooks?
They're dorks.
They're dorks.
Homer was a real G. He's basically saying
Homer was the real G.
Homer was a great artist.
We should reevaluate morality to go back to this.
World of color. It's 3-dimensional, where there's Corinthian columns everywhere, and there's philosophers everywhere, and there's different poets talking about different things. There's Dionysian, there's Apollonian. There's all these different aspects of life. We got to go back to that. Bring life back. That's what he's saying. I agree with Nietzsche on that. And I think, by the way, and this is why I'm so direct on me saying that the Torah is actually newer than what we thought. And the reason why is because Judeo-Christianity, Islam is the newest religion in the world.
Yeah.
The last person to come along. All these other pagan rites are the real ancient rituals of our culture that this like Jungian archetypes are based off of. That's the real mystical religions are the old ways.
Well, I guess this is something you see in modern, like we'll say, reactionary right-wing culture and all this. For like, I know Neil, maybe you wouldn't even identify with that, but I just want to use that as just the easy way of thinking about it, because you have people like Andrew Tate. You could look at figures like even someone criticizing, for example, Israel, for example, very heavily, like Nick Fuentes or Sneeko, doing the same thing. All of them would be attaching themselves to an Abrahamic religion, because it's like, this religion. Jordan Peterson, as I said, is kind of attaching to this. And if we were to kind of like look at all these ideas that we're presenting here, we're essentially trying to say something even more crazy, that like that's literally, you're not red pilled when you come to that. You're actually just landing on a deeper net and getting caught up in that, and then thinking you've made your way out of the matrix or something like that. But the actual next level is figuring out how to break through that.
They're selling blue pills as if they're red.
Well, this is
it. Yes,
this is it. So it's getting trapped in this, I guess you could say, trapped by the noble lie, trapped within this stuff. How exactly does this disempower people though? Like Islam, for example, is a really well structured religion that has like a sophisticated set of family systems and community values.
It's also the Dark Ages, I think.
Well, regardless, like it's coherent, and it could resist maybe the degeneracy of the modern world. Christianity would make the same claim.
I'd rather have a world of degeneracy that I can avoid than live in a Dark Ages society where I have no choice, where give me the degeneracy where I can be a stoic in my own worldview, and I can like whatever. There's degeneracy around me. I know how to avoid it. I could be my own person.
Well,
be an individual.
Neil,
I'd rather have that.
I do have a challenge here, because like I can imagine someone like, we'll say Tate. Now I know that's probably not the paradigm that maybe people want to hear about, but like Tate I'd imagine him saying something like, "Hey, I'm rich and I can be degenerate as I want, but I want a stable society out there. And Islam and Christianity, they create stable societies. And I don't want to spend all my time reading Nietzsche. I want to drive my cars. I want to do OnlyFans or whatever he's doing, or I want to do Hustlers University." And so he's like, these are the things I care about. And I don't want I don't want to encourage degeneracy. I would actually rather a noble lie out there reining it in, so people are like normal.
Don't you need degeneracy to sell your OnlyFans shit?
All right, well maybe.
I think it's an incoherent. I think it's an incoherent worldview, in my opinion.
Well, maybe not Tate then. Maybe Tate would be a bad example. But you can imagine like
I get what you're saying, yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Like someone would say something like that. A king would turn around. You get someone and he becomes a king, and it's like, what do you want to do? Do you want to try and invent a new religion, or use one of these religions that works to create
I would
order?
say this. I would say I agree with Petrarch, one of the medieval writers who coined the term Dark Ages, not because the world was unlivable and that it was like it wasn't like a war-torn apocalyptic world, not because of that, but because of he's looking at the world which Homer and Hesiod and the pre-Socratics were living in, where you have all these different poets and different playwriters having different worldviews and putting out different ideas out there. And then you have, after 500 AD, between 500 AD to 1000 AD, you have almost nothing but church text. And it's almost like a sheltered society where everyone is living what is like, it's like going bowling with the bumpers on. Everyone's just protected by the church, and close your eyes from the evil stuff. You need the duality of evil and good to understand how good the good is. You need to have that world. I think it's good to have some degeneracy out there for people to compare righteousness with. You have to have both sides. I think an open world, a three-dimensional world, a colorful world is better than a darkened, sheltered, church-governed world.
Okay.
That's why.
Okay. Adam, what do you think about these questions?
I would rather lean on the side of having freedom than having an authoritarian, theocracy or monarchy, religious monarchy running everything according to ancient scriptures and ancient rules, like, a death penalty for blasphemy, death penalty for not believing, for being an apostate, punishment for, not covering yourself up from head to toe. I think it's all nonsense. And and I'm not for the noble lie. I've debated this with Christians before, and I think people, especially today, people can handle the truth a lot more. So it better than keeping them locked into the old ways. I feel like you could have secular arguments for, not having degeneracy or decadence as well.
Mm-hmm. So you were bringing up, for example, like head to toe coverings and death penalties for blasphemy. So this is actually an interesting question. Do you think that, like, maybe we'll say these influencers, I'm not saying these influencers run the world or anything like this, but you're seeing this rise now of traditionalism, right-wing Christianity, conservative Islam and stuff like this. So the Abrahamic energy is rising. Do you think that these guys might be like sort of summoning a force that they might not even understand? Like maybe, Sneeko thinks it's cool to be a Muslim, but like if like Abrahamic Christianity and Islam took over society again, I began to like fundamentally shut down a lot of avenues of society, he would all of a sudden be like, whoa, what is this monster that has come out, and he can't put it back in its shell type thing. Do you think something like that would be coming, or would it be like?
Of course, I don't want the fanatical Christians or any fanatical religious group taking over. I mean, we're talking about apocalyptic messianic cults that are all waiting believe we're in the end times. They believe wars have to happen or certain prophecies have to happen before Jesus is going to return and destroy the Antichrist. We can't have a society. It's inevitable that a society where that's the dominant religion is going to end in destruction. It's almost inevitable at some point. They're gonna want to blow up the world, and we're almost there right now. We got like Christian Russia and Muslim Iran and largely Christian Protestant America like about to have nuclear war over the Holy Land and the chosen people in the Middle East. So like this is the fruits that it's led us to, and it's not a surprise because these are like self-manifesting. Prophecy is a con, but it's also like there's some truth to prophecy. If there is a prophecy, it's like self-manifesting and self-fulfilling just by their beliefs. Believing in something is their fulfillment of prophecy. So yeah, I see. If I could press a button and nobody believed in Abrahamic religion anymore, I would be banging it.
I would be too. This is also why the Delphic Oracle was so vague, because it would give you a vague prophecy, an oracle that's like the bull has been sacrificed. This is not an actual prophecy they give to Coricius, and he's like, oh, that means I'm going to win the war, and that the Persians are the bull being sacrificed. And it's like, that could have happened. He could have won the war, and then he would have thought that was the prophecy. but then he loses the war, and now he's the bull that's sacrificed. So they're just giving a vague oracle that whatever happens, the bull is going to be sacrificed, right?
Yeah.
So it's like, is it true? Maybe. I'm not saying it's not true. Maybe there was something prophetic about that statement, but it's also, like you said, it's vague enough where it's kind of self-fulfilling.
It's like placebo or law of attraction, you know, this type of thing. Well, what do you see then as the sort of political ramifications for this stuff? So we obviously see in the Middle East, we have Israel. They do have like an enormous connection to the Christian Zionist Rust Belt of America. And would you say that these prophecies are then leading to this? And so, like you said, Adam, there a second ago, that it looks like World War III is coming around the corner, and because of how we're getting kind of sucked into the prophetic theses, like, you know, like I think it's Gog and Magog and things like this, and the sort of transformation of the world and preparation for the end time. You even see people bring over like the red heifers over into Israel and all this. And you might not believe this stuff, but it's weird that people are putting these religious practices into practice and kind of seeing them through. So what are you seeing on that front? Your mic's off.
Right. Nobody's going to dispute that people's religious beliefs influence their attitudes and their behaviors and their actions. And it's like, it's not a surprise that we have nuclear war. You know, we're on the cusp of nuclear war, fighting over the Holy Land and the return of the chosen people to their land and fulfillment of prophecy. And the Christians have been egging it on. The Muslims believe their end times version as well, which kind of coincides with the others. So it's a disaster. It's a disaster, but they see it as a good thing. They see these end times wars and chaos on the earth, the birth pangs of the Moshiach. It's described as good things because it's God's divine plan unfolding. So,
well, maybe I could ask some questions there, like with all these concepts swirling around in people's heads. Like, do you see, like, does it give us any weird predictive power where we can sort of say, like, all right, these groups are going to find a Moshiach-like figure at some point and project all the authority of them onto him? Like, because that's like, if we among the West, we were like, Caesar, 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 a Caesar-like figure stands up. Trump kind of has that energy a little bit,
right?
Know?
I was just going to say Trump.
And people
you've got Bar Kokhba, you got Jesus, you got Zabbatai Zevi, you've got the Frankists. There's if you believe in messiahs, there's always going to be messianic pretenders or contenders. Right. There was many messianic figures that Josephus writes about in the first century because of that messianic fervor, right?
And so, like, I guess the argument then would be for people to snap out of it and come to their senses and sort of just, like, it's almost like plug out of the matrix, you know, and sort of
a mind virus, I think.
Yeah.
And by the way, like you said, right now it's Trump. 20 years from now, whoever the leading theologians of Judaism and Christianity are at that time, 30, 40 years from now, they're going to look back and say, yeah, those idiots thought it was Trump. But it's like, no, that would have been you if you were around 30, 40 years time of Trump. It's just going to keep reinventing the wheel. It's not going to change. I've even said, I think if humans are still around in 5,000 years from right now, Christianity, Judaism will be evolved into something different, but it'll still exist. That's the power of religion. It's got this. As long as there's an old ancient text that people can read, they're going to believe it.
Yeah. Neil's black pill. There you go.
I sure hope not. I hope we survive that long. They don't blow up the world before then, but they'll view it as like the ancient superstitious past. That'll be thousands of years ago. This will be known as all of the Judeo, Torah, Yahweh era, basically, that dominated with the meme, the messianic Yahweh meme that's dominating the world so much. But I got to get going pretty soon, guys. Yeah. We're over 3 hours, and I gotta watch the baby.
There's so much to talk about. We can do a part 2 if you want to do.
Sure, yeah. Well, I think this is good. It covered like some pretty big theses, so let's definitely wrap it up here for the time being. Then, so gentlemen, thank you very much for your time. Neil, Gnostic Informant, check out his YouTube channel. Adam from No More News. Unfortunately, he's been banned on YouTube. I think you can see that Adam is polite, so it might be valuable if YouTube would consider his channel back. But you can find him on Rumble, and I believe you're also on Twitter as well. And Adam, maybe if you want to shill your stuff first, and then we'll go over to Neil. So please tell people where they can find you.
Sure. nomorenews.org, and that's KNOW, like knowledge. And you can find there links to Jesus Deception playlist. I've got a rabbi and Christian compilations, epic compilations. I do interviews, debates, news streams, deep dives into religion. commentary and analysis on rabbi clips, all types of fun stuff. So check it out if you're new.
Beautiful. Neil, tell us about yourself. I'm sure people will know where you are, but for anybody who doesn't.
Yeah, I'm currently not banned from anything, which is good, and so I'm a little easier to find. The YouTube Gnostic Informant, just type it in, it'll come right up. I make documentaries, I do interviews, I go live once in a while, do those type of stuff. My channel is pretty active. I'm working on some pretty deep documentaries at the moment. Yeah, I'm actually debating what if alt hist in a couple days
No way.
Dark Ages. Yeah, which is surprising. I didn't know he would ever. Whatever, that's cool. I respect that he's going to come and have a discussion with me. So maybe I won't be so. I was kind of an asshole to him on Twitter, but
I know.
Maybe I'll stop doing that. I respect.
We're still in the Dark Ages. We got all these Christians denying evolution, the age of the Earth, promoting flat Earth, denying dinosaurs, all types of nonsense.
Yeah, I'm looking for it. And that's one of the documentaries I'm actually working on right now. Is the term Dark Ages legit? Is that a fair analysis of the time of the Middle Ages? I say yes.
Yeah. Okay, interesting. All right,
giving a very fair and balanced approach to it, though.
All right, gentlemen. Well, look, there'll be documentaries coming up for Gnostic, as we said, and Adam has playlists for anybody who wants to deep dive into this stuff. I do recommend you check out their stuff, because they've long thesis length videos in this. I've literally tried to just go over a lot of these things, but there's details. There's details, sources. Adam would often play. Adam has this great way where he'll just gather large amounts of videos of people talking about this stuff, scholars. And you hear it from their mouths, and this is a big deal because you understand that it's not a story. Someone's not trying to spin a story and persuade you. They're showing you information, and you can kind of think for yourself about it. And Gnostic does this as well. Gnostic digs through a huge amount of sources, talks about the problems of sources, presents it in documentary style. So these are very, very valuable pieces of knowledge. So I recommend you check out these gentlemen, and thank you very much, gentlemen, for your time. And I'll talk to you again soon.